We went on a camping trip to Harriman State Park. It was me, Simon, and Eddie, just the three of us, looking to get away from the city for a weekend. We planned it for weeks, packed our gear, and drove up from Brooklyn on a Friday afternoon. And the park was quiet when we got there, and we set up camp near one of the smaller lakes, a spot that we'd picked off of a map because it was far from the main trails. By the time we had the tent set up and a fire going, it was already getting dark, but the first night was awesome. We had hot dogs, a few beers, and the first serious catch-up in months. And the next day, we decided to hit the trails. It was late morning, and we didn't have any kind of plan. We just followed a trail until it kind of petered out and then kept going anyway. My buddy Eddie had his phone out, snapping pictures of mushrooms and random rocks, while Simon kept talking about finding a good spot for lunch. I was just along for the walk, half listening to them argue about whether there were Bigfoots in New York. And after a couple of hours, the trees started thinning out and we came up on a small lake that we hadn't seen on the map. It was small, less than 100 yards across, and right there near the shore was this lone wooden shack. It wasn't much to look at. The wood was this sort of weathered grayish-brown type and splintered in various places like it had been sitting there for decades at this point. The roof kind of sagged a little, and there was no glass in the single window. Just a square hole with a torn scrap of curtain hanging inside. The door was left ajar, not locked, just creaking on its hinges when the wind pushed against it. Simon said it looked abandoned, and Eddie agreed, but I wasn't so sure. Something about it felt off, but we were curious, so we went closer. Inside, it was pretty dim. The light from the window barely reached the corners, and the air just smelled musty, like old wet dirt and old wood. There wasn't much in there. A wooden table in the middle, a couple of broken chairs tipped over in the corner, and some rusty nails sticking out of the walls. And the table caught my eye first. It was rough, splintered, and covered in some dark stains. These sort of big, uneven patches that looked almost black in the shadows, and I ran my fingers over one, but I couldn't tell what it was. Eddie said it was probably bloodstains. Simon agreed, pointing at the walls. They were lined with hooks, maybe a dozen of them, screwed into the boards at different heights. Some were bent, others rusted, but they were empty. No tools, no ropes, nothing hanging there now, and it made sense to think a hunter had used this place maybe to skin deer or whatever else he'd shot. And that's what we told ourselves anyway. It was creepy, but I suppose not unexplainable. And we continued poking around for a few minutes. Simon kicked at the curtains, and Eddie took a picture of the table, saying he'd show it to his brother who hunted upstate. And I just stood by the door, pretty much ready to leave. To me, that shack did not feel right, and then when we stepped outside, I was glad to be breathing lake air again. We started walking back toward the trail, figuring that we'd head to camp and eat, and it was around about then that Simon tripped. He was a few steps ahead of me, near the side of the shack, when his foot caught on something. He stumbled, his arms went flailing, but didn't fall. Eddie and I caught up, and there it was. Something metal sticking out of the dirt, just an inch or two above the ground. It was dull, rusted in certain spots, and half covered in soil. And at first I thought it was a knife or maybe a hatchet, something a hunter might have dropped and forgotten. Simon crouched down and brushed some dirt off of it, but it didn't budge. He said that it was stuck. Eddie handed me his water bottle and told us to dig it up. I grabbed a stick and started scraping at the dirt, and Simon used his hands, pulling up clumps of earth and just tossing it aside. And the more we dug, the bigger things got. It wasn't a tool. That much was there. There was a curved edge, and then another, and soon we could see it was hollow inside. And after 10 minutes, we had it mostly uncovered. It was a helmet, or at least something that looked like one. The metal was heavy, maybe iron, pitted and rusted, but solid. It was tall, pointed at the top like a pyramid, and the front had 2 slits for eyes shaped like crosses. Not the kind of crosses that you might see at a church. They were sharper, uneven, like someone had hacked them in with a chisel. And the whole thing was strange. It definitely didn't belong here, and it creeped me out just looking at it. Eddie steps back, asking what it was, and Simon picked it up, actually grunting at how much it weighed, and held it out in front of him, saying something like, looks like a clan hood or something, he said, but metal. And I didn't think it was that. The clan didn't wear iron pyramids on their heads, and as far as I knew, it felt older and heavier, like it wasn't meant just for show. Simon turned it over, looking inside, and he said it smelled like rust and mud, and then smiled and said, "I'm gonna put it on." "No, you're not," Eddie said, snatching it from him. And he set it on the ground and wiped his hand on his jeans. "It's filthy. At least clean it first." Simon shrugged, but I could tell that he was serious about trying it on later. But I didn't like it. The helmet gave me a bad feeling, like it was almost watching us through those cross slits. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound paranoid like I've been listening to your channel for so long. And we left it there by the shack and headed back to camp. The hike back was pretty quiet though. None of us talked much, and we just kind of kept our eyes on the trail. And by the time we got to the tents, the sun was starting to go down low. We built a fire, cooked some pasta on the camp stove, and sat around eating it with some jarred sauce on top. We talked, and before long, that helmet came up again. Eddie said it was probably some art project, maybe a prop from a movie shoot that got left behind. Simon, though, he didn't buy it. "It's too heavy for that," he said. "Why bury it?" And I didn't have an answer. I just kept thinking about those stains on the table and the hooks on the walls. The shack didn't feel like some hunter's place anymore, not with that thing outside. But we let it drop and finished eating and stayed by the fire until it burned down to just embers. It was after sundown, maybe about 9 or 10, when Simon got up. The sky was dark and there was no moon, just stars and the faint glow of the coals. And he didn't say anything, just grabbed his flashlight and started walking off into the trees. "Hey, where you going?" I called after him. He didn't answer though and just kept going. Eddie and I looked at each other. "He's getting the helmet," he said, and I nodded. We could have stopped him, but we didn't. Simon was gone for a while, longer than it should have taken to walk to the shack and back. Eddie started pacing, muttering about how stupid he was for walking off on his own like that, and I just sat by the fire, poking at it with a stick, trying not to think about that helmet sitting out there in the dark. When Simon finally came back, he was empty-handed. He looked pale and he wouldn't look at us. Eddie asked what happened. Simon sat down on a log and just stared at the ground. "I threw it," he said. "Out in the woods somewhere. Didn't want it looking at me." Eddie asked what he meant by looking at him, and Simon didn't answer. He just shook his head. And Eddie continued to press him, but Simon wouldn't say any more. He looked shaken, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. And we didn't push any harder than that, and the fire was already dying and none of us wanted to stay up much longer. We climbed into the tent, zipped it shut, and tried to go to sleep, and I just laid there for a while listening to the wind and Simon's uneven breathing. I kept picturing that helmet though, those cross slits starting out from wherever he tossed it, and wondered what kind of person would make a thing like that. And the next morning we packed up early. No one said it, but we all wanted out of there. The drive back was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional car passing us on the highway. We didn't talk about the shack or the helmet, not then and not later, but it stayed with me. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering what it was, where it came from. I'd think about that shack and the stains and the hooks and that thing buried in the dirt. It didn't feel like some hunter's tool or some lost prop. It felt like something darker, something that none of us were supposed to find. And years later, I looked up Harriman State Park online, trying to see if anyone else had come across that shack. I didn't find much, just trail maps and reviews from hikers. Nothing about a lake with a shack or a buried helmet. Maybe we'd wandered further off the path than we thought, and maybe it's still out there, rustling in the woods where Simon tossed it. I don't know. I haven't been back and I really don't plan to. And whatever it was, I'm glad we left it behind, but sometimes, late at night, I still see those cross slits in my head, and I wondered if we walked away from something worse than we'll ever understand. I think people know this already by now, but most adult shops are nothing like people used to expect. I mean, sure, I'm sure they started out like that. Men in long coats buying dirty magazines hidden inside brown paper bags and then scurrying in and out as if they were committing a crime. These days, they're actually very clean, tasteful premises filled with a host of diverse clientele. There's no peep show behind a plastic curtain, no sticky pink carpet underfoot, no faint sounds of moaning coming from somewhere in the back, no 80s weird videos playing on a grainy TV bolted to a ceiling corner. There were stores like that though, and I worked in one. And I'll just call it Angel's Delight, which was actually the name of the rival business my bosses hated. It was in a single-story mall on the outskirts of bumfrick nowhere, and even being a store that sold adult toys and dolls, we were still one of the classiest joints in that whole godforsaken building. I don't like to speak badly of others, but man, some of the motley crew that I got to know during my years in that place. There was the tattoo artist who I'm convinced could have made a stick figure look like complete crap. And there was the piercing store that basically guaranteed a ride on the sepsis train with every ear piercing. The liquor store where, rumor had it, the liquor was the least intoxicating thing they sold. Then there was the inexplicably high-fashion boutique run by an elderly, very conservative couple who were about as fire and brimstone as you could really get. And yet, every Friday night, they'd come into Angel's Delight and buy some of the most specific adult films we stocked. "Just doing our part to get this smut off the streets," the husband would say to me every single time while the wife clicked her tongue disapprovingly. If it was really for that purpose, then tell me, why did they only rid the streets of adult films that featured a very specific whole, a very specific racial combination, and came from a very specific production company whose movies had a serialized plot? Maybe they watched it for the articles. Genuinely, I heard about the articles so many times that I lost count. And my dude, I work here. I don't care. I'm not judging you. Hell, if you didn't slither in to buy hardcore adult mags, my bosses wouldn't be able to pay my wages and I'd have to take out student loans just to get through college. And that's why I was working there. I'd attended college for 1 year, and the crushing anxiety of even a partial student loan for that 1 year had led me to put school on hold and spend a few years working to earn enough to pay the rest of my way through. Adult shop manager was far from the only job I could find, but comfortably the best paying prospect I had. You'd think that a position in a shop like that would be easy to fill, haha, but when I first got the job, my bosses told me that I'd been only the second applicant. When I asked about the first, all they said was that some people were such big freaks that they could even scare away the hardcore fantasy crowd, and I didn't ask any further questions, just sort of snapped up the opportunity. And after a few years there, I was genuinely considering whether I wanted to go back to college or if I should focus on this career in this industry. Things are really going to pop off throughout the 2000s, my boss has said in 2002. Things were really looking positive for the brick-and-mortar adult shop field. And yeah, I'm glad I decided to go back to college the following year, and the event I'm going to tell you about played a big role in sending me running back to academia. It was an entirely unassuming fall Friday at the mall, a couple of hours from closing time, and we stayed open later than most stores due to the nature of our business, and other premises in the mall had already shut their doors for the night. Mr. and Mrs. Fashion Boutique had already been and gone with their latest VHS acquisition. The day was winding down nicely, and like I said, most of our customers kind of snuck quietly into the store. Not this guy. The front door came flying open with such force that I discovered that it had permanently broken the chair of the little bell that hung above it, and that was the least of my worries though. The guy came sort of stalking through the store. He was tall, really tall, easily 6.5 feet tall, but he wasn't big. He wasn't muscular or broad, just very lanky, not really imposing or anything, kind of gangly. And if he hadn't burst in like that and stormed toward the counter, I wouldn't have thought anything of him. Instead, I had to, because he got all up in my face, slamming down a brown paper bag he jabbed toward me with his finger. "This product is defective, and I'm going to return it for a refund." I rolled my eyes visibly and gestured to the huge no return sign on the wall over my shoulder. "You can return this," he insisted. I knew better than to reach into any brown paper bag purchased from Angel's Delight. The bosses told me how some frat bros would try to return their used adult toys as a prank, and to this day I don't know if this was a joke or an urban legend or what, and it's never happened to me, but I'd be damned if I was going to risk touching anything that had been in anyone else. What's the item?" I asked. "Can you remove it from the bag?" The guy sighed theatrically and took the product out of the bag. I didn't recognize it immediately, but he flipped the box over and I saw that it was an inflatable rubber mask. Kind of like a GIMP mask, but made of stretchy latex rubber. A hose ran from the mouth hole to a pump and the mask could be inflated while being worn. I had no idea when this item had been purchased. We'd had one in stock ever since I'd worked there, and at some point in the last few months it had been sold when someone else was on shift. I knew it had to be over a week ago because I noticed it was gone from the wall by then. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. The guy fumbled with the box, not out of embarrassment, I don't think, but anger. He pulled the rubber mask out, the hose flapping against the counter, and he held it up. "It's torn. Look," he said, and there was a tear at the neck, as if the material had sort of corroded. Hell, maybe that's exactly what had happened. I know rubber and latex expire after a while, and the mask could have been ancient, just sitting on the wall since the store opened in the 80s. Might be entirely not this guy's fault, and his GIMP mask had unfortunately been defective. No returns absolutely meant no returns, though, even in a case like this, and the only way my bosses would have allowed me to refund a customer would have been out of my own pocket. And if you agree to no returns ever, then that means no returns ever. Why should I have to give this guy $20 plus sales tax out of my own hard-earned money? That's a shame," I said. "I guess you should have been more careful when you were putting it on." And I know I was being a jerk, but I didn't like this guy getting all up in my face. And oh boy, did I pay for it. I barely had time to react when Tall Man reached over the counter, grabbed me by the back of the head, and slammed my cheek against the desk. I could feel the pump of the goddamn GIMP mask pressing into my temple. Tall Man leaned down to my ear, and he didn't whisper when he spoke, and I'm afraid that I'll have to paraphrase here. The years haven't been kind to my memory, so I don't have a perfect recollection of exactly what he said, but I think you'll get the gist. "Listen here, you smut-peddling, smug dipstick. I know it says no returns, but you sold me a defective item. Would you expect to pay someone else's mistakes? No. Then why should I be expected to pay for yours?" He pressed down harder on my head, and I swear to God, I thought my skull was going to pop right then and there. The guy was way stronger than he looked. "Nuh-uh," I remember blabbering through my mouth, mushed into the desk. "No, sir. So I want to return this item for a refund," he said, and he held me there for a second, and I wondered what the holdup was. Then I felt the cold metal press against my head. "I want a refund," he said. Then the metallic touch left me, and after a few seconds he let go. When I straightened up and could see properly, I didn't see a gun on him, and like most people in October, he was wearing a long coat, and to this day, I can't say for sure that this angry adult shop customer had held a goddamn gun to my head over a $20 inflatable GIMP mask. I'm not sure. But what I can say for sure is that he got his money back, Hell, I gave him $30 because I was shaking too much to count out the right amount. And then it was like his whole demeanor changed. He brightened, smiled, thanked me, and then left the store. And he even took that mask in the bag with him. And so I couldn't even prove to my bosses that any of it had really happened. Not that I would have called the cops anyways. Not in that mall. Not when I was working at that store. It wasn't the really kind of place where you even bothered with the cops. I did tell the bosses about it though, expecting them to probably doubt me, but when I described the guy, they seemed to know exactly who I was talking about. "Oh yeah, him," the one boss said. "He can get like that sometimes," the other boss added. "Next time, just process the return." Now that night I decided that I'd saved up more than enough money to go back to college, and so the next day I handed in my notice, worked out my next 60 days, and then left that mall adult shop industry and never looked back. It was the summer of 1979 when the idea of going on a camping trip first came up in conversation. Mark, a close friend of mine since high school, had been griping about his job for weeks. He'd been working some soul-crushing desk gig at an insurance company, and our mutual friend Joey and I weren't much better off either. I was bouncing between temp jobs and Joey was stuck in a warehouse moving boxes for minimum wage. We wanted to get away from things so bad. Anything to break up the monotony of either working or hanging out, but we didn't have the money to go jet-setting to the Bahamas, and we couldn't all get the time off for an extended road trip. And so instead, we decided to go camping. After a little discussion, we decided that the Harold Parker State Forest should be the spot. With it being just an hour's drive north of Cambridge, it was close enough to home that it made for an easy journey, but far enough and large enough to make it feel like a real escape out to the wilderness. When I say it's big, I mean it's big. It's over 3,000 acres of pine and oak and takes about 6 or 7 hours to walk across on a good day. We knew because we'd been there once before, a day trip a few years back, so we figured 3 nights in early fall would be just right before the weather turned too cold and too wet. We started planning in more detail once the date got closer, pooling our resources to keep our costs down. My old rusted blue hatchback barely passed inspection, but it'd do for the trip to the forest, while Mark managed to dig out his dad's ancient 2-man tent from his garage. It was still in decent shape despite a few patched up holes, but since it only fit 2, Joey brought along a little one-person deal that he bought cheap at an Army-Navy store. We split the rest of the gear, sleeping bags, a cooler, and some cool cooking stuff, and Joey tossed in a fishing rod and I grabbed a couple of tarps in case it rained. Mark got a hold of a map of the park, one of those foldable pamphlet things that you can still get from the park's welcome center, and then after that, we figured that we were all set. I remember the drive being a lot of fun going up. We left on a Friday afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky as we blasted going up country and Born to Be Wild on the car stereo. And then about an hour later, we rolled into the forest just as dusk started to settle. The gravel lot near the entrance only had one other car parked in it, and after putting a few bucks in an envelope at the small wooden self-service kiosk, we picked a campsite near a place called Berry Pond. It was a flat clearing, surrounded by tall trees with a fire ring already set up. The ground was blanketed in needles, and through the trees, maybe 50 yards off, the waters of the pond was shimmering in the light of that setting sun. It was beautiful, thinking back on it. We unloaded the car, hauled our stuff over to the site, and then got to work setting up camp. That first night was great. Mark got a fire going with a lighter and some crumpled up newspaper he'd brought, and then we cooked the hot dogs on a stick and heated the beans in a dented pot that I'd found in my mom's basement. The food wasn't exactly gourmet, but out there it was tasting better than I expected it to. When we were done with the dogs, we cracked the beers and then sat on a log that we dragged over to the fire. I leaned forward, just kind of staring at the flames, and felt the stress melting away from me as I thought, this is exactly what I needed. The next day, we decided to do some exploring, and so we picked a 3-mile trail that looped around the pond and up to an overlook. The path was narrow, and the woods were alive with the sounds of leaves rustling overhead and squirrels and animals darting through the underbrush. And the view from the overlook was well worth the hike, though, with the forest stretching out before us under the morning sun. And we sat there for a while, passing around a bag of trail mix and kind of dumbstruck by how beautiful everything was. It was all just so peaceful, and as much as the forest appeared wild and untamed, we felt safe. But we were wrong to feel that way. Sunday started just the same. We hiked again, a longer trail this time, and then got back to camp in the late afternoon, tired but very satisfied. Mark napped in the tent as I gathered more wood, then after eating while the sun was setting, we figured that we had to sleep early since we were so beat from the day's hike. With Joey's tent just this dark lump nearby, I zipped up our own, and then as I got into my sleeping bag, Mark was already snoring beside me. The forest went quiet, just the occasional sound of an animal, and then I drifted off to sleep. But I remember waking up cold. The air in the tent felt wrong, damp and cold. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and saw the flap was unzipped. I sat up and shone the light around. Mark's sleeping bag was empty and his boots were gone, but his jacket was still there, wadded up in the corner of the tent. I checked my watch and it was just after 4:30 a.m., so I figured he'd gone to take a piss somewhere and would be back any second. I lay back down and waited a minute, but there was nothing but silence. Another minute went by and there was no whistling, no footsteps, nothing. After another minute, I sat up again, clicking my flashlight back on as I shuffled towards the flap of our tent and peeked outside. It was pitch black out there. The darkness was just swallowing up the beam of my flashlight as I scanned for any sign of Mark. I moved it one way, then another, but there was no trace of him anywhere. I felt kind of silly as I climbed out of my sleeping bag. Something like, was I really that much of a sissy that I'd given myself the creeps over nothing more than a friend going to the bathroom? And as I put on my boots, I figured that I'd probably get no more than 10 feet before I'd spot Mark returning, and I'd have to explain what a little scaredy cat that I was, getting the willies over him going wee-wee. But this other voice in my head kept speaking over the others, asking, but what if you don't? What if he's in trouble? And after pulling on my jacket, I climbed out of the tent and stood up, and turned around in a circle with my flashlight in my hand. I was ready to see him walking back, but when I didn't, I took a few footsteps before calling out Mark's name. Kinda low at first, so as not to wake Joey unless it was absolutely necessary. And I circled the campsite, shining the light into the trees, but when I saw that there was nothing but shadows, I started to get this really bad feeling that something was wrong. I called out Mark's name again, louder that time, and that's what woke Joey. I heard rustling in his tent before he unzipped it, and I turned, trying not to blind him with the flashlight, and he just blinked up at me. His hair was a mess, and then he asked what was going on. We went through this whole back and forth of me telling Joey that I thought Mark was missing, him asking if Mark wasn't off taking a pee, and me assuring him that I wasn't just being a pansy. Then, once he was convinced something was wrong, Joey put his boots and jacket on and then climbed out of his tent. We went off searching in different directions at first, circling the campsite at a wider berth while calling out Mark's name, and my flashlight cut through the dark, picking out trunks and bushes, but no sign of Mark. When we met back at the campsite, Joey suggested Mark might have been sleepwalking. Apparently he'd done it a few times as a kid, and that one time, he made it all the way downstairs and into his backyard. I doubted it, but we widened the circle anyway, moving deeper into the woods. Only that time we agreed to stay together. As we walked further and further into the woods, the ground began to slope downward with loose roots threatening to trip us up with each step into that darkness. And my feet and socks were already soaked, and the night was so chilly that my hands shook holding that flashlight. The forest felt even bigger now, denser and harder to navigate, but still we pushed on, yelling for Mark as we went. After about an hour of what felt like walking pretty much in circles, Joey suddenly stopped. He pointed his flashlight toward a bush and something gray that was snagged on it. I aimed my own light, and when I did, my heart sank. We each saw the unmistakable sight of Mark's hat, that faded blue one that he'd been wearing the whole trip, hanging from the bush's thorns. We stared at it for a second or two, not moving, and then Joey spoke up, saying it didn't make sense. We kept moving, each calling out Mark's name again. Then about 50 feet onward, we found his socks, one, then the other, tossed aside like he just peeled them off and left them there. Next, we found his jeans crumpled in the dirt, and then his t-shirt, and then his boxers, all spread out over the course of maybe 50 to 60 yards and on a very deliberate path. Each of us started trying to make sense of what we were seeing, with Joey asking if I'd seen Mark drinking any liquor or using anything stronger. We drank all that beer that we had with us on that first night, but then, as much as I didn't like seeing him drinking any, there was no guarantee Mark hadn't been sneaky with a secret fifth of bourbon or something. But even if he had gotten drunk out of his mind in secret, he wasn't the kind of guy to go streaking through the woods in the middle of the night. And that just wasn't Mark's brand of humor, I guess. We went back and forth for like that, maybe for a few seconds, carried on calling out Mark's name as loud as we could, and then I think maybe a minute or so later, we saw it. Just ahead of us, lying chest up on the ground, was the lifeless, decapitated body of a young man. Blood soaked the ground around it, having poured from the stump above his shoulders. The cut looked clean and straight, too, and the rest of the body looked untouched. No marks, no wounds, just pale, unblemished skin, bright white in the beams of our flashlight. And I think I kind of just shut down for a second or two. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And it's weird to think about all these years later, but there was a moment where I thought to myself, is this even reality? I didn't think it was a dream, or that I might be hallucinating or anything like that. It just looked fake to me. I guess my brain refused to accept what I was seeing for a second and had me thinking it was some kind of movie prop. The way the bright white skin had this almost bluish tone to it, or the way all the blood had sort of congealed around the neck wound and made it look like plastic. I'd never seen a dead body before, so I guess I had no idea what to expect. But for the life of me, I didn't expect to see all of that. I guess Joey had a similar kind of reaction. He didn't think it was Mark, or at least he didn't want to think that it was Mark. And I'll never forget the deep feeling of hurt that I felt when, instead of accepting it, Joey carried on calling out his name. Joey yelled louder and more frantic, over and over, pacing around that body but never looking at it. He kept saying it wasn't him, that it couldn't be. His voice kept cracking as he spoke. And I just stayed frozen. The flashlight I remember trembling in my hands as it slowly just sort of sank in for me. That was Mark. The height, the build, no tattoos or scars. It had to be him. And besides, all his clothes were lining the forest just a few yards away from us. My throat closed up as I tried to get the words out, and in the end I had to force them out, saying, "Joey, it's him. It's Mark." He shook his head, saying no over and over. He still wouldn't look at the body. He just paced back and forth, hands on his head as the tears welled up in his eyes, and I said it again louder and angrier, my voice trembling, and he stopped yelling and then started just sobbing into his hands. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't sit. I did the only thing I could think of, which was walk over to Joey and try to console him. Once Joey's cries had quieted to just gasping, I held him while saying, "We gotta do something, man. I know it's messed up, but we gotta do something." Once he kinda calmed down enough to understand, we made our way back to camp as quickly as possible, even running at some points where the ground allowed us to. I don't know why we did that, looking back on it. Maybe it was just to feel like we were helping in some way, but by then, time wasn't an issue anymore. Our friend Mark was gone, and he was never coming back, no matter how fast we ran. Once we were back in my car, we took off along that road until we reached Middleton, and then after turning left towards Ranger HQ, there it was ahead of us. There were only 2 rangers manning the place since it was still before 6 a.m., but after we stumbled in, panicked, grief-stricken, they gave us some cups of coffee and let us tell our story. Joey did most of the talking and his voice was an absolute mess, but I did my best to help him out whenever he stumbled over his words. They asked us questions we could hardly answer, and we gave up trying to explain and just begged to let us show them. The sun was coming up by the time we got back to our campsite, and everything looked just as it was when we left. And from there, we walked the accompanying ranger out to Mark's body, and when he saw it, all he could do was tighten his jaw. He then turned to us, narrowing his eyes, and asked what happened. I said we didn't know, and that we just found him like that. Joey nodded, and at that point his voice had gone hoarse. The ranger just stood around asking us a few more questions, but it slowly dawned on me that whatever we said, he was not buying it. He didn't act hostile in any way. There was no pushback at all, in fact, but something about the way he acted told me that he didn't believe us. He got on his radio and called it in. 1 body, decapitated, 2 witnesses. Then he told us that we weren't free to leave yet, and we were to wait back at our camp. EMTs eventually got there, and then the cops followed in 2 cruisers with their lights flashing silently, I remember. They split us up, me by the tents and Joey near the pond, and then they started to question us. Where were we when it happened? What did we hear? Did Mark have any enemies that knew about this trip? Their questions came on thick and fast, but there was no sympathy or comfort issued. They thought we did it, and I could see it in how they treated us. After we were done talking, we were told that they'd have to bag everything up as evidence, and when I say they took everything, I mean they took everything. Our clothes, our gear, the cooler, both tents, all 3 sleeping bags, and the little knives that we'd use for cooking. We didn't object to any of it, and we knew that we'd done nothing wrong, and we just wanted to go home. Once the 2 cops had finished questioning me and Joey, they talked amongst themselves for a while and then told us that we better head to the station with them. We weren't under arrest, they just wanted to question us someplace that they could properly record it. Again, we hadn't done anything wrong, so we didn't object, and they drove us to the precinct before putting us in separate rooms. And those interrogation rooms were small and gray, with a metal table and a 1-way mirror. A detective sat across from me with a notepad out asking the same things the 2 uniformed cops did over and over, just in different variations. I told him everything that happened that night, from me waking up to seeing the flap was open, then the search, the clothes, and the body. When I finished, the detective leaned in and then asked if Mark and I had fought, or if I'd been jealous or angry with him for any reason. I said no, and it was a forceful one too. Me and Mark were friends, best friends. The detective didn't blink. He just wrote it down and then started off on the same old line of questioning. Where were we when it happened? What did we hear? And did Mark have any enemies that knew about our trip? A few hours later, they let both me and Joey go. He got pretty much the same hotbox treatment as I did, and by then, he'd also realized that the eye of suspicion was firmly upon us. We were scared, really scared, and each of us imagined some botched trial that'd see both of us wrongly convicted of first-degree murder. But even when faced with such a terrifying prospect, our fears were still dwarfed by the horror of what, in God's name, happened to our friend Mark. It still doesn't make any sense to me, even all these years later. If we'd come across him lying there, dead from a single gunshot or stabbed to death, but fully clothed, that would have been bad enough. But then, how'd he end up taking his clothes off like that? And who took his head? About a week after we were questioned, forensics came back clean. It was good news, but neither me nor Joey ever felt like celebrating it. There was still the matter of Mark's death, and more importantly, who the hell killed him. But after many, many months of obsessively investigating, the case eventually turned cold. The cops had no weapon, no motive, And there was another thing that stayed missing. Mark's head. Cops and rangers searched the area around the scene for days hoping it'd turn up someplace, but it didn't. Whoever killed him had taken it with them. It all feels like a lifetime ago. Joey moved west about a year later, got a job out in Oregon someplace, and we don't talk a lot these days, but we do keep in touch. We just don't talk about what happened. I stayed around Cambridge, but I fell apart for a while. I couldn't hold down a job, even stuff like stocking shelves or driving delivery. I just blank out mid-shift, see Mark's body again and the blood soaking in the dirt, and then I just disappear from whatever I was doing and drink. Days were bad, but the nights were worse. On the off chance that I was sober when I fell asleep, I'd inevitably see Mark walking away from me through the woods, stripping as he went. I'd run after him, calling out his name, but he was never able to hear me. Then when he did finally turn around, he was headless. I'd wake up in a cold sweat with my heart pounding, wondering why I wasn't still back in that tent. Friends eventually drifted off, and my girlfriend too. She stuck around a year and then bailed when I couldn't open up about what had happened and my drinking problem. And I didn't blame her. I still don't. I was a complete mess. Drunk or sober, I'd sit in my apartment, lights off, staring at the wall. And then sometimes if I had to go out, I'd drive past wooden spots and see the trees. And my grip would tighten around the steering wheel. Years later, I eventually hit rock bottom. I lost another job, stopped leaving the house, and stopped eating altogether, and then lost a bunch of weight. My sister dragged me to a doctor who put me on meds, and they dulled the edges, but the nightmares just didn't go away for a long, long time. She found this therapy program, cognitive behavioral, she said, a pretty intensive one too. And I started in the spring, twice a week. And those shrinks were good. They didn't push too hard, and one said writing something could help force me to face it instead of burying it. I could lay it all out, all the details, and maybe it'd lose some of its power over me. It worked better with time, just not by much. Mark is still gone. His case has stayed cold, and no one has ever found his head, who took it, or why. I don't go near that state forest anymore, or any wooded area at all for that matter. And while I'm better than I was, I'll never be the same person that I was before. The old me stayed out there in that forest, and in the exact spot that we found Mark's headless body. And just like my old high school buddy, he's never coming home. I'll get this out of the way up front. My name is Paul, and I was a mall cop. You'd think this would have been unbearable, but I served my stint as a security guard at a certain small-town mall in the 90s, so I'd left the job before the movie came out. I worked in private security now, but back then I was employed directly by the mall. It wasn't a huge mega mall by any means, but it had a couple of stores, about 20 stores in fact, and a food court, and a central fountain that the kids would throw coins into and make a wish. What this mall did have was a huge warehouse complex at the back. This is one of the big draws for businesses in the mall. They got a portion of the warehouse area as part of their lease to store stock and what have you, and some of them didn't need it and others took advantage of it. Then other local businesses would lease warehouse space to store their own goods and items. The point is, this mall had a large maze of interior storage units out the back, so the area of the mall that shoppers saw was maybe only 40% of the property. Shoppers would stroll around browsing Radio Shack or Borders or the one store that always stuck out to me, Gadzooks, all sorts of clothing stores too. I won't explain the mall layout exactly. It was haphazardly built, kind of a pain in the ass to get around, and sometimes you could find yourself in one section of the mall's upper floor and you'd have to go down one escalator and back up another to get to the other side. If by any small chance anyone who lived in the area around the 90s is listening, this description plus the storage warehouses is probably enough to make it clear which mall I actually mean. If you know, as my kids say. I'm painting this picture so you understand that the mall wasn't some big open-plan architectural masterpiece with wide walkways for shoppers. It was cramped, claustrophobic, and by the time I started working there in the 90s, it was already feeling run down and out of time. Couple that with the huge warehouse complex out back, and you can imagine why they needed round-the-clock security. There was a lot to explore, a lot of hidden corners that could hide all sorts of ill behavior. And for the first year on the job, I barely had to deal with anything more than a few shoplifters. One old guy was perving on a young woman, a missing kid who was found safe and well sitting in a photo booth, and a few kids who got dared to try and sneak into the warehouse to stay overnight. Weirdly, they were the ones that management came down on the hardest. Really wanted to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. In the end, nothing came of it. They were barely older than 18, but the bosses were weirdly angry about someone trying to stay in the mall overnight. I guess when you think about it, they could have caused untold damage, but like I said, we were a 24-hour security detail, so one of us on shift would have caught them pretty quickly. The weirdness really began a couple of years into the job. The first time, my buddy Chris and I were on a mall shift, and an older, more seasoned guy, Bryn, was in the security office monitoring the cameras. It was mid-afternoon, mid-week, and the mall was average busy. Then I get a call over the radio. It's Bryn. He told me we had a code whatever in my sector and for an unattended package. Now, this was one thing that would make most of us jumpy. We were only a few years past the Oklahoma City bombing, and tensions were still high about any abandoned packages or vehicles in populated public areas. We never had a direct bomb threat, but we'd found a few abandoned bags and things. I guess we were pretty reckless, because we'd never called in a bomb squad. Usually you could just see that they were things shoppers had bought and accidentally left beside a bench and whatnot. This time, it was one of those filthy duffel bags tucked underneath a bench in the corner overlooking the central fountain. Nobody was looking at it when I reached the area Bryn directed me to. I'm not sure if nobody had noticed or nobody cared, but I remember that damn bag like it was yesterday. It was dirty, like it had regularly been rolled in dust and debris and maybe chalk. And as I got closer, it was clear that it stank. Of piss, of all things. I remember thinking, who pisses on a goddamn bomb? And that's why I just sort of strolled up to that damn bag and grabbed it, just swung it out from under the bench. I know, I was an effing idiot and I put lives at risk. Present day me would give my past self a swift backhand to the head, but I was a dumb kid. And in my defense, as I'd gotten close, I could see the bag was open and that there were clothes inside. And that's where the piss stink was coming from. And that's what was in the bag. A black sweater, a pair of black jogging pants, a pair of black socks, all stinking and clearly well worn. No big deal, I thought. Someone just kind of abandoned their old clothes after buying a new fit that day, I guess. The only slightly odd thing was the filthy plush cat also tucked into that duffel bag. Clearly an old, much-loved childhood toy. I don't remember much about it, to be honest, but at the time I just shoved it back into that duffel bag, a bit disgusted at the smell, and tried to push down any thoughts of what the cuddly toy might imply, or who it belonged to. I radioed Bryn that everything was fine. It was just a bag of clothes, and took it out to the dumpsters out back, making sure to thoroughly wash my hands afterwards. Didn't even get reprimanded for my reckless decision to grab a potential bomb. Nothing happened for a week or two. And then, like deja vu, I get a message over the radio again from Bryn about an abandoned bag. Don't be a dumbass with it this time, kid. He'd seen me swipe it up on the cameras, of course, so not much point in hiding it from him, and I confirmed that I would not. Went to the area that he directed me to, beside one of those fake plants in another forgotten corner of the mall, and sure enough, there was an identical duffel bag. This one didn't reek though, and it was clearly a newer bag, but aside from that, it was the same. This time it was more out in the open, so even though it was a bit reckless, I was able to approach and sort of peer into it without touching anything. Again, I know I was an idiot for not even calling this one in, but to my underdeveloped mind, I could see that it was closed again, so it was going to be the same thing, and I was sort of right. There was no plush cat this time or toy of any kind. Instead, there were a few food wrappers, junk food that you get from a grocery store, sort of like Twinkies and beef jerky, that kind of thing, and some packaged goods. So either that was a goddamn weird coincidence, or the same guy had left the same generic set of clothes and the same brand of duffel bag lying around the mall twice in 1 month. Despite this one not being so foul, I still disposed of it in the dumpsters out back, and really thought nothing of it beyond mentioning it to Bryn and a couple of other colleagues. The next duffel bag sighting came only a few days later. This time one of the store workers had found it in a female dressing room, and by now, talk of the previous 2 duffel bags that I'd found had spread around some of the workers, which I guess is why they called this in. I remember talking to the girl who called it in. She was barely over 18, and she went totally white when I said that it could have been an explosive device. Hadn't even considered it. I acted all macho and sort of stern about it, like I'd been the picture of responsibility when I'd found mine. Yeah, not really. The girl had already opened the bag, so there were no surprises this time except for the smell. This one stank even worse than the first one. Really old, musty, rotten almost. Thankfully no piss this time, but that didn't make it better. The girl looked like she was about to puke, so being the gallant, manly security guard that I was, I took it off of her hands and, you guessed it, to the dumpster out back. This time I didn't even check if there was anything else in there besides clothes. I wasn't touching that crap. And so by now, we've had 3 abandoned identical duffel bags with 3 abandoned identical sets of clothes. I think it was Chris who first brought this up one day on break. And due to the job, it was rare for us to take breaks at the same time as each other, but for some reason that day, we were. "Maybe there's someone living in the mall," he said. He was joking, but I latched onto it, coming up with arguments about why that could be right, how it made sense, etc. In the end, I think Chris kind of got annoyed with me and left, telling me that I was some conspiracy theorist or something like that, and maybe he just didn't want to deal with the possibility. But no, hear me out. My logic went like this. 3 identical duffel bags, 3 generic identical outfits. 2 of them had clearly been dumped because they were stinking and old. And who knows about the middle bag? Maybe there was some damage to the clothes that I didn't see because I didn't exactly examine them or anything. Maybe the guy had crapped his pants that time, who knows? So I started putting together reasons why the details could be the way that they were. Because the guy was taking them out of the storage warehouses. They were stocked from one of the clearance outlets in the mall. You know the type, sells cheap clothing, bags, all that good stuff. So this guy was dressing in cheap clothing from the warehouse and what, living in there? When I present it all like this, it makes me sound like some crack detective who worked this out in seconds, with one of those boards with red string and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't like that. It took a few weeks for me to put all these pieces together. It's something I thought about absently from time to time, and during this period, a 4th duffel bag had been found in one of the men's public restrooms on the 1st floor. Nothing to do with me that time, but I heard about it from the guy who found it, and this time it had been found emptied all over the ground, the contents kind of just strewn about. The theory was that someone else had found it before us and gone through it to see if there was anything worth stealing. Hell, maybe there had been, but I don't think so. It was just the old clothes or more perishable food wrappers. My chance came a few weeks later. It was my turn to switch with the night guys, and I liked the night shift. I was just coming out of a bad breakup at the time, so I liked the silence, the time to think. I've always been that kind of person when there's badness afoot. I like to be by myself, kind of lost in my own head, and I have a couple of creepy hiking experiences because of this that I might send in one day, who knows. And so I was glad that I had the night shift because I needed the space for my head, but I also am glad because it gave me an excuse to poke around the warehouse unimpeded. I tried to bring it up with colleagues in the previous weeks, but the senior boys in particular were very keen to dissuade us from poking around back there, and at the time, I started to entertain some really weird thoughts about it all, but later discovered that it was totally unconnected. Some local business that rented this space did so under the agreement that poking around wouldn't happen, and I guess that explains the haphazard security cam coverage in the warehouse areas too. Certain areas, especially inside Warehouse B, were complete camera blind spots for the most part. I had a pretty strong suspicion that the blind spot areas, and thus the areas my night shift led me to patrol the most, were where someone might actually be hiding. I've told events slightly out of order because I guess I have a flair for the dramatic, and in the weeks leading up to the start of my night shift, I'd become convinced that I was seeing things. Nothing wild, not talking or creepypasta tier, just obvious things. Glimpses of black-clad men carrying that specific black duffel bag, always blending into a crowd or disappearing around a corridor. People whose faces I could never get a full look at, who always seemed to be deliberately keeping just out of my reach. But at the time, I knew that I'd look like a nut job if I pursued that, or even told anyone. Hell, maybe in the years since, I've built it up in my head and remember it happening more often than it did, but it's enough that even looking back now, it gives me, the grown-ass man who's worked some tough security jobs, the shivers. There was something about the shapelessness of it. The idea that someone wearing black was sneaking around the mall, my mall, even though they hadn't done anything bad except for leaving stinking clothes around. Well, not yet anyway. So, first night shift, I almost ran to the warehouse B route in eagerness. Dumb, I know, but when I got there, I kind of paced myself, started walking the route normally. The warehouses had lights, and we were allowed to have them on during patrol, so it wasn't some sinister pitch black walk through the dark, or at least it wasn't meant to be. I walked the route, probably whistling, trying to look like a picture of doesn't care to who, no idea, and this area wasn't even covered by cameras. But then I started looking a little closer at things. Just take a look, I thought, And I remembered this shelving unit belonged to one of the clothing clearance stores, and I figured that it wouldn't hurt to double check the boxes, that kind of thing. Like I was trying to convince myself in my own head that I wasn't investigating the idiotic idea of someone living in the back corridors and hidden corners of the mall, because obviously that wasn't happening. How could it have been? Why would someone? But then, I found the nest. Yeah, okay, it wasn't a nest like that, not some creature's lair, but it was a collection of boxes on a huge bottom shelf that had been opened and taped together to form a kind of tiny room. It was barely disguised, and I have no idea how anyone missed it before I found it. To this day, there's a tiny part of me that suspects that he wanted to be found, and specifically by me, because I had been the one to find his first duffel bag. And I'm sure that's just my dramatic side talking again, but, you start to wonder. As mall security, we had these extendable baton things, and I never had a cause to use mine for violence, and I hope that night wouldn't change that. But I had been waiting for an excuse to extend it with a whooshing wrist flick motion in the line of duty, which I did at that moment, or at least tried to. Of course, that's the time that it didn't work properly and the baton got stuck and I had to extend it by hand, and I'd shown that move off to buddies God knows how many times, and the one time I finally got to use it, I fumbled it. So I approached this obvious nest of boxes. Of course, I didn't know what was inside at this point, just that it was a bunch of boxes taped together, and I could see an opening in a space beyond. "Hey, anyone in there?" I called out. "Mall security. Giving you one chance to come out with your hands up." I don't know why I said with your hands up. We didn't carry guns. It just sounded like something I should say. "Yeah?" I called out, or something else, and there was no movement from inside the box, and I reached forward with my baton and parted the flap that served as a door. And holy crapola, the stench. It was honestly like chemical warfare. Jesus Christ, and until that point, I'd had no idea that the simple odor of the human body could end up being that foul. It wasn't soil from a human or anything like that. It was purely the stench of human existence. No wonder this guy, and it obviously was this guy, kept disposing of his bags of clothes. There was a bundle of generic brand sleeping bags in the nest, one clearly slept in and the others used for padding. I mean, the guy had access to all of this backlog stock, so why not? There were also 2 or 3 of the black duffel bags in there, still in cellophane wrapping, and a stack of the generic black clothes that I'd been finding. I backed up a little bit and assessed my surroundings, trying to place which store this particular area of storage belonged to. And then things clicked into place. The shelving area had belonged to the budget clothing store that had gone out of business last year. I guess for whatever reason they shut down suddenly and left their stock behind. And eventually someone would have come to clear it out. I had no idea what happened in a case like that though. I wasn't a retail worker. I do remember that around then it was unusual but not unheard of for a store to suddenly shut down. And clearance generic brand clothing sold cheap. You don't have to be a genius to connect that kind of store with sweatshops. So who knew what possible reasons could have led to a shutdown and abandonment of stock? Now leaning back in, covering my nose, I tentatively peered into the den that my squatter had been inhabiting. Nothing else really identifying or interesting, and I figured that we'd have to call the cops to report an intruder and they could go through this little living area and the warehouse overall and search for any identification or evidence of wrongdoing besides breaking and entering. I was a security guard, not a detective, and it wasn't my job to investigate the crime, just to stop it from happening. It felt like an anticlimax, but I was relieved to finally have the matter taken out of my hands. As I backed away from the den and straightened up, I realized two things at once. One, the den was empty, which meant the guy was gone. And two, the den was empty, which meant the guy could be anywhere. And I fumbled for my radio, dropped the freaking thing because of course I wasn't acting like the manly hero I'd always pictured in those scenarios. Then, when I was sure the brick of a unit wasn't broken, I radioed through to the security office. One of my favorite colleagues was on that night, and she was a motherly figure who brought in home-baked goods, and we all affectionately called her Mom. I can't even remember her real name, to be honest with you, and how she ended up in mall security was something I'll never figure out, but of all the senior guards who could be working the cameras on any night, having Mom there was a particular reassurance. I realize now how weird it must have sounded to be overheard saying, "Mom, I think there's a guy down here," into the radio. But it was the squatter guy who would have heard me, so screw him. Naturally, she radioed back asking me to confirm just what in the blue blazing hell I was talking about and whether I was okay. I didn't even have time to reply when, and I swear to Jesus Christ Almighty above, the lights for the entire warehouse B building went out. Boom. Total pitch black darkness. And this wasn't something that often happened. There was no fancy timer, no famous generator problems. If the lights went out, it was because someone hit the switches. My mind didn't run through the usual "I'm being pranked" nonsense. The nest, the duffel bags, they were not a prank. Nobody I worked with had the imagination or the motivation to pull off something so elaborate. Just wasn't a thing. So the only explanation I even entertained was that the guy who had been living in the mall was still in the warehouse and had just shut off the lights. Thankfully, we carried flashlights on the night shift, and I tried to get mine off of my belt just as, and I swear to God, I heard footsteps pounding across the warehouse floor. Running footsteps coming directly at me, fast. The light switches weren't far from where I was. I got my flashlight up just in time to see someone wearing black, a scrawny figure charging straight at me. He barrels into me at just the wrong moment, catching me perfectly off guard so that I fell right backward, slamming against a shelf. I heard him mutter something, saw him stumble in the waving beam of my flashlight, and then just take off down the aisle. God damn it. What should I even do, I thought. I wasn't paid nearly enough to get murdered on the job, but my pride had been hurt, and my shoulder. So, I got up and ran after him as I radioed to Mom, panting out what details I could, getting frustrated as she kept asking me to repeat things. The guy seemed like he was darting down corridors in the dark, and I was barely keeping up with him using just my flashlight. In the end, I just yelled for Mom to call the cops to the warehouses, now, and drop the radio so I could run faster. For a moment, I lost him. Then I heard a door slam somewhere down a corridor and knew where he must have been headed. There was a small complex of rooms between warehouses A and B, just a break room, a bathroom, etc. And I started jogging down there. And for all I knew, he was waiting on the other side of the door with a machete or a gun or even a fire extinguisher, and I probably didn't take nearly enough care as I burst in. The lights were still on in there, causing me to kind of wince and reel back, and thankfully, No weaponized squatter was there waiting for me, just an open door leading into the bathroom. I went through the open door. The bathrooms in that area were 2 individual rooms, men's and women's, with 1 toilet, 1 sink, etc. in each. These weren't public bathrooms, just for people who had reason to be in the warehouse zone. The women's bathroom was open and I could see a ceiling vent covering lying on the ground like it had been pulled off and tossed aside. I stepped in and shone my flashlight up into that hole, and I thought I could hear the faint sound of someone crawling away through those vents, but maybe that was just my imagination. I was so fixated on the vent that it took me a moment to notice the writing in the mirror. Now, I can't say for sure that it was from this guy. It could have just been graffiti left by literally anyone at any time, but like I said, these were worker bathrooms, the female bathroom as well. Does that really matter here? I tend to think of women as just generally less likely to vandalize bathrooms. And if that makes me sexist, so be it. I just couldn't imagine anyone doing it in their own workplace. And on the mirror, in Sharpie, someone had just written the F word and eat poop. Not exactly written like that. Laid out exactly like that, with the F word on one line and eat poop on the next. I remember the exact wording to this day, and to this day, I have no idea if our guys sharply simply just didn't work for the word off after the top line, or if he wrote exactly what he meant to write. Sadly, I can't tell you that I pursued him into those vents like some action hero, or Batman, I guess. Absolutely not. Sorry, I wasn't about to die in a vent in my 20s for an almost minimum wage security job. I'm not die hard. And I waited for the cops, who showed up very shortly after. Now I'll rush through what happened next. Basically, the cops investigated, and we had, indeed, had a squatter living in the mall. He hadn't limited himself to his den in that warehouse either. The cops, management, and us guards found at least 4 other areas around the mall, and only one of them was in the warehouse. The others, well, we'll just say that he got around the whole complex. It was an old maze-like building, as I said earlier. Not all that hard to get lost in the corridors and maintenance closets and the vents and the gaps between stores. In every little nest that he had, we found duffel bags in the same black outfits. We never found any boots, though. He'd been wearing heavy boots when he charged me, and I remember those thundering footsteps. I guess his boots meant something to him, so he never changed them. But the clothes, yeah, just these basic black garments. And trash, loads of food wrappers from stuff that he'd stolen from the warehouse and eaten. Nothing really nutritional, and he must have been in terrible health by the time I chased him off. And we really found nothing else. No sort of manifesto, no sinister plans, no other writing, no ID, no personal belongings. But I always remember how in that first duffel bag, there was that one dirty plush cat. And had I thrown that guy's one beloved possession into the dumpster out back? And is that why he told me to F off and eat crap? And that phrase became a running joke around the security guards for a while, until, like all things, it eventually fizzled out. It was kind of just easier to focus on that than consider how incredibly creepy and unsafe it was that someone had been living in the walls of the mall for who knows how long. Probably the same reason management was very focused on keeping it covered up. I never found proof that anything truly terrible had happened, but of course the vents and crawl spaces had access to the bathrooms and the private and public ones. There were dressing rooms, all sorts of places for someone to hide, and if they were so inclined, he might even watch. We all publicly agreed that it was better to just not know, as long as he never came back, and you can believe security was pretty tightened up, at least for a while. I left the role about 18 months later, and by then, things had calmed down somewhat. But those of us who had been there at the time still talked about that shadow in the walls, so I really don't have any definitive clue about who this creepy, stinky guy was that knocked me over, and I know that's pretty disappointing, but I do know who he was, sort of. As about 10 years later after I left that job, I was in a very different place and position in life. I was in a relationship with someone who would later become my wife, and she was also from the same town. We'd grown up together, but not together, if that makes sense. The kind of relationship where you meet later in life and remember each other. She knew about that mall shadow, obviously, and many of the other bizarre stories. But this one had always stuck with her because she'd been to that same mall many times. Even though we lived across the country by that point, my wife, though we weren't married yet when this happened, still got our local weekly paper mailed to us by her mom. It was sort of a cute thing, but now I kind of wonder if her mom did it purely for this purpose. There was a story a few pages in about a man who had been arrested. His charges were stalking, harassment, and conspiracy to kidnap. He appeared to be an unhoused individual and had been living pretty rough, while repeatedly stalking a handful of women in the area. This time, when they picked him up, they had found a manifesto. According to the newspaper report, it was a notebook that he had just filled with scrawlings about one unnamed young woman in particular. I couldn't find any more about the case online and never really have, even in the years since, and I guess the charges were eventually dropped, or maybe he died or something. He looked very sickly in his mugshot that they printed out, and I only saw his face once, in a sort of frantic flashlight all the way back then while he was charging at me, so I can't be certain. But I know that was him. That was the guy who had been living in those dens throughout that goddamned mall. And it just goes to show you that you really never know who's out there. You may never find out what people are thinking or what they might do if pushed just the right way. And sometimes just thinking about that keeps me up at night more than any confirmed murder or direct act of violence. Just the idea that it could happen at any time, from anywhere. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors, and my buddy Chris was the same. We'd been friends since we were kids, back when we'd skipped class to mess around in the ravines near our neighborhood in Toronto, and over the years, that turned into a ritual. Every summer, we'd pick a spot, pack pretty light, and head out for a weekend of camping. Then, as time went by, we found that we had to raise the stakes to get that same old buzz. We coined the term hardcore camping, which I'm pretty sure is a case of parallel thinking rather than just us being original. But it basically involved no tents or stoves, just ponchos, ground sheets, and whatever we could carry on our backs. We'd bring a little food with us, but in such small amounts that after a couple of days, we'd have to forage and fish and otherwise live off the land if we wanted to eat. It wasn't easy, but that was the point. Then the year that we were both 24, we chose Algonquin Provincial Park, a massive chunk of forest and lakes up in Ontario, for 7 days of wilderness living. And we started out strong. The first day we hiked 12 miles from the trailhead, cutting through thickets of pine and birch, and the air was cool, the sky was patchy with clouds, and after our day's hike, we set up camp near a shallow creek. I rigged my poncho over a low branch while Chris gathered sticks for a fire, and then we ate some jerky, boiled some water from the creek, and let the flames of our campfire die down as the stars started to come out. It was quiet, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But that was kind of how we liked it. No noise, no people, just us and the wild. Day 2 was a little tougher. The terrain got harder, all rocks and roots, and we had to climb a steep ridge to keep heading north. My calves were burning by midday, and the much taller Chris kept outpacing me as his long strides ate up the ground in front of him. And that night, we slept on a flat stretch of moss, and the ground was very cold. And I woke up once to the sound of a twig snapping, my hand fumbling for the knife that I kept at my side, but apparently it was just a deer moving through the dark. Now by day 3, we were nicely warmed up, and we fell into a steady rhythm. Our packs were lighter now, our food supplies were dwindling, but we were used to it, and hunger was always the best motivator to me. That afternoon, Chris caught a small trout in a stream with a line that he'd made out of something in a hook, and we cooked it over a fire, splitting that flaky meat with our own hands and drinking water that came from the fast-moving streams, and it was better than any bottled mineral water on the market at the time. We checked the map every now and then, but mostly we moved pretty much on instinct, letting the forest guide us to potential campsites. Algonquin was huge, thousands of square miles, and we were deep in the middle of it, far from any roads or ranger stations. But that's exactly why we were there, you know? No safety net, just us and the great green beyond. The fourth day started just like the others. Chris was already awake and rolling up his ground sheet as I climbed out of my tent. Then, we ate the last of our granola, shouldered our packs, and started up north again. The forest was dense, and we didn't talk much. We just fell into step, with our feet being pretty much the only sound we could hear. Now, around noon, we stopped at a narrow stream to refill our canteens. I knelt by the water, splashing some on my face, when Chris tapped my shoulder. "You see that?" he asked, pointing off into the distance, and I followed his eyes, and there it was. At first I couldn't see what he was pointing at, but then I saw it too. A shape, with too many straight lines to be natural. We grabbed our packs and moved closer, pushing through the underbrush. The trees started to part, and there it was. A building, or more specifically, a church. The walls were old wood, gray and cracked like they'd been standing for 100 years or more. The roof was steep, covered in moss and fallen needles, with a rusted cross perched at the top. Another cross hung from the front door, which was boarded up and chained shut with a heavy padlock. There was no steeple, no windows, just this worn, weathered box, half swallowed by the forest. I remember turning to Chris, saying something like, "What the hell?" And he didn't answer. He just pulled out the map, spread it out on the ground, and began tracing our route with a single finger. And there was nothing where the church should have been. No marks, no symbols, no hint of anything man-made for miles in any direction. I remember saying how strange it was, seeing a church with no paths or roads leading to it, and far from any residential areas too. Chris folded the map up. His eyes were now fixed on the building, and he said something like, "Let's check it out." We circled the structure, stepping over roots and ducking branches, and the chained-up door was the first thing that caught my eye. The rust was very thick, and the padlock seemed untouched. It looked like no one had been here in forever. Then as we got around the side, we saw a hole where the rotten wood had been scraped away. It was low and very jagged, just big enough for a person to crawl through. "It's gotta be an animal," Chris said, peering into the dark. "Probably used this place as a den." And he was probably right. But when he shrugged off his pack and dropped down to his hands and knees, that's when I started to feel uneasy. I said something like, "Are you kidding, dude? You want to crawl inside?" And he says something like, "Duh. You don't want to see what's in there?" I mean, I did, but I figured we could just shine our flashlights inside and then take a look from outside the hole. And I suggested that, but Chris ignored me, just dropped to his stomach and started wiggling through that gap. I couldn't let him go inside alone, so, of course, I followed. I ditched my pack and followed him, the rough edges scraping my shoulders as I crawled through that hole in the wood, and the air inside that church was damp, cold, and stale. We stood up in the dim light, brushing dirt off of our pants, and the place was completely empty. No pews, nothing. Just bare walls and a floor of packed earth littered with dry leaves. At the far end stood a huge wooden cross, but what really stopped me was in the center of the room. A steel trapdoor, partially covered in dirt, and its edges bolted down and wrapped in thick chains. Another rusted padlock hung from the links, sealing it tight. I stepped closer, staring at that trapdoor. It looked solid. No scratches, no markings, just cold, dirty metal. Chris then walked over and knelt beside it, and the chains rattled as he gave them a tug. They were clearly solid. I remember wondering out loud what might necessitate something like chains, and Chris looked up. "Maybe it's not a church anymore," he said. "Maybe it's some kind of hideout." Now that much was obvious, but for what? And who? Chris stood up wiping his hands and said it could be anything. Cash maybe, some smuggler's stash, or loot from a robbery, locked up and forgotten. I mean, why else would it be chained up like that? And I just shook my head. A bunch of cash seemed like a stretch, and it could just as easily be something dangerous. Nuclear waste, chemicals, something toxic people didn't want found. I think I made a pretty good point, but Chris just wasn't hearing me out. His eyes had this sort of edge to it, like he'd already decided what he was going to do. "We gotta get in there, man," he said, heading for the hole in the woods outside. "Let's find something to break the chains." I yelled for him to wait and then grabbed his arm, but he yanked free and crawled out anyways, and I just scrambled after him. Now outside, Chris started pacing around the church, kicking at the ground. I asked what he was doing, even though I already knew, and got the exact answer I expected. "I told you. I'm looking for a rock," he said. "Something heavy enough to smash that lock." But the forest floor was flat there, just needles and small stones and nothing big enough for what he needed. I said he was acting stupid, that even if something was down there, it was a crazy idea to try and go get it. I told him that if he was right and there was cash or jewels locked away in there, they might belong to some gang member, in which case stealing from someone like that would be like signing our own death warrants. Again, I thought I made a pretty good point, but it was like Chris couldn't hear me, and I'd never seen him like that before. He was a spontaneous kind of guy, but he wasn't stupid. I asked him to stop, but again he just ignored me. "I'll hike till I find something," he shouted, striding off into the trees. "I don't care how long it takes." And that's when I snapped. I ran after him, grabbed his shoulder and spun him around, and I asked him what the hell had gotten into him. And he shoved me back, and then we started wrestling. He might have been taller, but Chris, he was much skinnier, and it was hard work, but I had to shove him against a tree before anyone got hurt. I yelled at him to stop again, to just effing stop, and then suddenly, it was like he could hear me again. It was like he came to. He froze and then let go of me, and I stumbled back. Both of us were breathing heavily from kind of tussling for a bit there, and I asked again what the hell had gotten into him. And he looked up, and his face at this point was pale and sweaty, and he said he didn't know. And I was just like, "Talk to me, man. What's going through your head right now? You didn't eat?" Chris repeated that he didn't know, and then after a second said that he couldn't stop thinking about that trap door, what might be down there, and that he felt like he needed to know. It was the adventure he was looking for. He looked kind of distant as he spoke too, rubbing his temples like he had some type of headache. And I crouched beside him, feeling the adrenaline fade as I asked if he was good to keep moving. He nodded, and we just went back to grab our packs, and then we put that weird church behind us. And the rest of the trip, though, felt kind of off. We camped 2 more nights and stuck to our routine, hiking, foraging, boiling water, but that spark and excitement for being out there was clearly gone. I kept watching Chris, waiting for that weird energy to reappear, but thankfully it didn't. He was a little quiet, but otherwise back to normal. And by the time we hiked out and drove back to Toronto, he was cracking jokes again like nothing weird had even happened. We started calling that church the Cellar Stash, turning it into some story that we'd laugh about over beers. But whenever I thought about it alone, it never felt all that funny to me. And back home, life slipped back to normal. I went back to my boring office job. Chris went back to working in kitchens, and we'd still meet up for drinks to plan our next camping trip. And whenever we did, the subject of the church would always come up, but it was always light and there was always a punchline. I'd ask him if he remembered losing it over that trap door, and he'd just kind of grin, shaking his head and say something like, "Of course I do. We'd be millionaires right now if it wasn't for you." We'd laugh and then change the subject, but neither of us ever suggested going back. In fact, we steered clear of that part of Algonquin altogether from there on out. It's kind of ironic, given how it was Chris that had seemed so suddenly and unexplainably obsessed with it. And not for me, but over time I realized that I couldn't get that church or the trapdoor out of my head. I just kind of lie awake some nights, picturing it. The gray door, the rusted crosses, the trapdoor sealed with its chains and padlocks. Chris's theories were wild. Cash, jewels, but I wasn't buying it. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was something way more sinister than some crook's secret stash. I'd think about how Chris acted, how he had that manic edge in his eyes that I'd never seen before, and wondered if it was just him or if it was something in the church or us hiking. I don't know. It did something to him, though. And then the months passed, and then a year, and Chris never showed another sign of cracking, and to this day, he's been solid as a rock. We went on other trips, smaller ones, closer to home, and there was like a sort of unspoken agreement that Algonquin was off the table. I'd scroll through forums sometimes, looking for anything about a church in the park, but nothing seemed to match. No records or stories, and it was almost like that place didn't actually exist. And maybe it didn't, not officially anyway. Maybe someone built it out there, away from everything for a reason we'd really never know about, long, long ago. And I tell myself it was just an old ruin, a relic of some forgotten time, and that me and Chris had just overreacted. But then I remembered the chains and the way that they'd sort of gleamed in the light and the hairs in the back of my neck standing up. Chris moved on, or at least he seemed to. He'd talk about the trip like it was nothing, like the church was just a weird blip. I played along and kept it light, but deep down, I knew that we brushed up against something that we weren't meant to find. I never told him how much it still bothered me, how I dreamed about that trapdoor some nights, and how I sometimes wondered if we dodged something worse than we realized. And it's been years now, and we are still friends. He's the same Chris, loud, stubborn, and loyal, and I don't think he dwells on it too much, but me? I don't think I'll ever fully let it go, hence why I sent it here. And that church, I know it's still out there. I'm sure of it. Standing silent among those trees, and whatever's chained up under that trap door, I sincerely hope it stays there. So just for clarity, I'm British, and I have a bit of an unusual job. I go from place to place, usually at night, all around the country, fixing vending machines, jukeboxes, and arcade cabinets. My company hires and trains people to fix any of these devices that someone might rent for their public space. 95% of my work is vending machines. Usually some crap like a pack of space raiders had gotten stuck in the prongs and nobody's confident enough to give it a good thwack. I don't advise that anyway, it voids your warranty. Now anyways, sometimes it's more fun though, and I get called halfway across the country to fix Mario Kart. If I'm really lucky, it's a classic arcade cabinet, an actual honest-to-God 80s one that's still functioning. These things are surprisingly robust and mostly just need a bit of maintenance. Tonight's job was in a motorway service station that's attached to a much bigger mall. After hours, only the service station area was open, which was a large open-plan room with a row of fast food kiosks, a side room with a few arcade machines, a corridor leading to public toilets, and then a big crate that would normally lead into the now darkened mall. I pulled into the car park. The huge unlit mall loomed over like a squat brick house, and honestly, the lights of the service station area were really welcome at that point. I'd been driving for hours, I was frazzled and craving a cup of garbage vending machine coffee. The car park had a few vehicles in it. I grabbed my bags out of the back of the van and headed into the service station. It was warm and smelled of McDonald's, very lush. My stomach rumbled, but the rule is no food until after I'd done the job. I grabbed a cup of black coffee with 2 sugars from the vending machine and headed over to the job, which in this instance was a 2-player Mario Kart arcade GP cabinet. One of the seats had come loose and one of the wheels had some drift to it, so I just needed to do a bit of maintenance. I got the job done in half an hour, quicker than I'd anticipated, and I'm pretty single-minded, so I hadn't really taken in my surroundings until this point. I guess I'm not one of those constantly hyper-aware true crime buffs who sometimes write in, who assess every possible threat. There were 3 fast food kiosks, which seemed to be staffed by just one person, a bored-looking middle-aged man with tattoos running up his gloved arms. In the back corner sat a group of people in hoodies who I guessed were teens. And then at a table in the middle sat two women, maybe early 20s. They seemed nice, so I smiled and nodded to them and then headed over to grab my usual filet-o-fish meal order. Yeah, I'm the one who orders that. I got the food from the grumpy fast food worker, sat down, and began chowing down on my fries. I was about halfway through the meal when the group in the corner got up from where they'd been huddling. When they stood, I could see that they were all decently tall, except for one of them who was particularly short. Nothing unusual, just notable, and made me doubt that they were actually teenagers anyways. My heart fell when I saw that they were all wearing masks. Again, nothing ridiculous, just scarf-type masks pulled right below their eyes and hoodies pulled down low. You know, the usual picture the British tabloids paint of knife crime hoodie youths. In my experience, though, that's mostly scaremongering and bluster, so if anything, I thought this was a wind-up. At least I really hope so, as the group of four made their way over to my table. They stood there facing me, no speaking, nothing. "Can I help you, fellas?" I asked, and I was trying to sound polite and not rattled, and I'm not exactly some weakling, but I'm not eager for a fight either. I was trying to catch the eye of the girls at the center table to see if they were in on it or anything, and the hoodie gang stared at me. Then one of them lunged forward and shoved the table. Not hard, but enough to try and make me jump. Absolutely classic school bully behavior. "All right, lads. I'm just trying to wind down after work. Don't want any trouble. Be on your way now." I thought I heard one of them giggle like that was hilarious. Idiot. The one who shoved the table leaned in and said, "You got a problem, mate," he hissed. Oh, okay. They were angry little lads with something to prove. "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger." "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger," he echoed. Just trying to eat my burger," one of the other tall ones said. The third tall one slammed a gloved fist down on the table, and my drink toppled over and I caught it before it could hit the floor. "Come on, lads," I said. "It's not worth it, is it?" I hadn't noticed the short one circling around behind me while the others distracted me. Hands fell on my shoulders. "Not worth it." And the voice was quiet, and I couldn't tell you if it was a girl or a little kid. My gut says it was probably a kid, maybe both. Probably why I didn't immediately respond with a swift over-the-shoulder elbow. "All right, forget this," I said, standing up. The hoodie behind me had to jump backward to avoid getting hit by the cheap service station chair. I grabbed my bags and made my way to the entrance, and of course that gang followed me. "Oi, bud, not sticking around," they jeered. But I was over it. I dealt with my fair share of schoolyard bullies and, well, obviously school, but I was way too old for this bollocks, even if it meant abandoning a McDonald's. And as we walked into that car park, I hoped that the service station worker would have the sense to lock the doors behind the gang, or maybe these kids were known to the service station folk, I suppose. Maybe this kind of thing happened here all the time. And as I fumbled at my van for the key, I saw the two women looking at us from the window. The gang were in the middle of the car park, about 5 or 6 meters away from me, and they were just watching me. I didn't want to turn my back on them by going to the back of the van, so I opened the passenger door and threw my bags onto the seat, keeping my eye on them. I did slip a socket wrench out of one of the bags, though, and hid it up my sleeve. "All right, I'll be off, lads," I said, backing around the van to the driver's side. I thought it would probably be better to keep engaging them instead of acting too scared. "Keep up the bullcrap, I guess." And they stood there and just simply watched as I got into the van, and I gunned that engine and put it into reverse, and I thought that I was going to get away scot-free. Then suddenly, they charged toward the van, just ran at the bonnet, slapping on it, hooting and hollering like some hyenas, and I jumped visibly and they just laughed harder. They had no fear at all that I might just drive into them or anything, so I slammed down on the pedal and peeled backwards in a U-shape through the almost empty car park and drove off. They chased me as I turned, slapping and banging on the side of the van a few times and then sank back into the darkness. Maybe I should have just run them over, but I bet that would have worked out worse for me than them, especially if one of them really was some kid. I stopped at a later service station to see if any damage had been done, and there was a big, thin gash along the side of the van. It definitely looked like it had been scraped with a knife. I spoke to my boss and then did call the cops, who said that there was always trouble at that service station and they'd swing by. I never heard anything about it though. The thing that terrifies me is that I'm not convinced they intended to let me get away. The way they lost control at the end there, like these wild beasts. I'm certain if I'd gotten out to confront them, I wouldn't have been leaving that service station in one piece. I've been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. Myself, Craig, and Tanner, my buddies, had planned it out, nothing really fancy. It was really just supposed to be a night in the woods. We picked a spot in the middle of nowhere, out in Tennessee, somewhere deep in the backcountry where the trees were thick and the roads were complete dirt. And it was just us, our tent, some beers, and a fire. It was pretty simple, the kind of thing that we'd done 100 times growing up. I figured it would be a good time, and it was, until the morning. We got there late in the afternoon. The sun was already dropping down, and we set up camp quick, pitched the tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. The night was going smooth, and the woods were pretty quiet. We sat around, drinking and laughing, just sitting around the crackle of the fire, keeping us company. And it felt good to be out there, away from work and the noise of town. And when I woke up, the fire was just down to ashes, and the sky was gray, and we could see that early morning light coming in. Craig and Tanner were still out cold, so I crawled out of the tent, stretched my legs, and then figured that I'd get some coffee going. I walked over to my truck to grab the pot from the back, and that's when I saw it. There was a skin, some kind of animal skin, stretched out across the hood of my truck. It wasn't just tossed there. It was laid out flat, like someone had taken their time spreading it. The fur was gone, scraped completely off, and the underside was raw and pink, just glistening and wet. Blood streaked down the windshield, thick and dark and already starting to dry at the edges. I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. The head was gone and the legs were cut off and jagged like they'd been hacked with a dull blade. And it stank. That sour, meaty smell that gets in your nose and just stays there. And all I could do was freeze, just staring at it as my hands started to get all shaky. I looked around, half expecting someone to be standing there watching me, but the woods were dead still. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just me and that thing on my truck. I kicked the tent to wake Craig and Tanner. They stumbled out groggy, but when they saw it, their faces went white. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. Something was clearly very wrong. We tore down camp fast, threw everything in the back of the truck without folding it up. I grabbed a stick and pushed that skin off the hood. It hit the ground with a wet slap, and I didn't look at it again. We piled in and I floored it down the road, tires kicking up dust, and the whole way I kept checking the rear view like something might be chasing us. But there was nothing there, and I really couldn't shake that feeling though. And we didn't talk about it much on the drive back. Craig kind of just stared out the window and Tanner kept messing with his hands, picking at his nails, and I just focused on the road, trying to keep my mind blank and avoid whatever was back there. And when we got to town, we split up pretty quick. I went back home, washed the blood off of my truck with a hose, and stood there watching as the red kind of just swirled down the driveway. It really didn't feel real, but my gut wouldn't settle. And later that day, I started asking around to see if anyone knew anything. This guy, Mr. Harris, at the gas station gave me a look when I mentioned it, and he said that he'd heard stories of people finding skinned animals left in their cars or porches out in the deep woods. Said that it had been happening off and on for years. No one knew who did it, but folks figured it was some type of warning, a message for outsiders or people who didn't belong. Harris said he'd seen it himself once, way back in the 80s when he'd camped too far out. He woke up to, I guess, a skinned rabbit on his cooler and apparently never went back again. I didn't sleep much that night, and I just kept picturing that skin, the way it was stretched out all careful, and I eventually got online and started digging. I found posts for people all over, all the same stories, these skinned animals left in the night, always in these remote spots. Some said it was hunters gone crazy or pranksters, and others thought it was something older, something tied to the land. One guy swore that he'd seen figures moving in the trees after it happened to him, but he didn't stick around to find out more. And the more I read, the worse it got. People talked about feeling watched, hearing noises after they got home, like whatever did it wasn't done with them. And I told myself it was nothing, just some sick joke, maybe kids messing around, but I really couldn't shake it. And I don't know who did it or what they wanted. Maybe we'd crossed some line, camped somewhere we shouldn't have. Maybe it was random. But I know it wasn't an animal that skinned that thing and put it on my truck. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. Craig and Tanner pretty much feel the same way. We haven't really talked about it much, but it's there, pretty much looming over us. And I still drive that truck, but every time I look at the hood, I still see that skin. I keep the doors locked now, and I don't know if it'll ever stop. All I know is that I ain't going back in those deep woods ever again. I live in a country where certain bad things are even more taboo than they are in the West. We do not like to speak about them, and one such time was in this tale told to me by my mother. In my municipality, there was a local shopping center that had recently been torn down, and I remember that when I was small, I used to visit this mall, and it was filled with smiling, laughing faces, people buying things, having a good time. I remember there was a food court on the bottom floor with all sorts of sights and smells that captivated my young mind. Cookies baking in a kiosk that smelled delicious and cuisine from all over the world. I loved going to that mall, running about and looking at all the stores. And I recall this huge spread of goods and services, from colorful children's toys to beautiful clothes we dreamed of wearing someday. And to me, as a child, this mall seemed like a magical wonderland, and trips there with my mother, father, and siblings, or with friends and their parents, were always very special and happy times. Now, when I was about 6, we were told that the shopping center would be closing down, and I remember crying. I knew my father worked there, and I believed that the mall closing would mean that he would lose his job. But no, he did not work for the mall itself. He was the manager of a chain store inside, and he had recently been promoted anyway. I soon forgot about my sadness, the mall, and moved on to other things as I grew up. It was only years later, returning home to visit my parents and seeing the news of the center's final fate, the demolition of the long-abandoned building, that I learned the true story of the mall's closure. It happened in the summer, shortly after the mall had closed to the public for the night. This shopping center was small, but very tall. There were perhaps 6 stores on each floor, with the food court taking up almost all of the bottom level. The next floor held toys and electronics and fun things, and above that was clothing and home goods, and finally on the top floor, some office space and a single stationery store I remember finding sort of exciting. The center of the shopping mall was open to the skies with a large sculpture roughly in the middle, and on a bright day, the sun would catch the sculpture just right, casting a sort of rainbow effect. And because of the dizzying height and the open design of the central column, each floor had strong reinforced glass to prevent anyone from falling to their doom. And I remember looking through the glass on the top floor, not even tall enough to look fully over the side, sort of craning my neck to try and see all the way down to the bottom. Of course I couldn't, but I remember that the balcony's walls were higher than my head, so they must have come up to about chest height for an average adult man. The store my father managed was a sort of menswear shop on the 3rd tier. That summer, the company he worked for had recently collaborated with a notable fashion designer, and a product release party was held in his store. It was just a small affair with a handful of fashion journalists and photographers and a select group of customers invited for early access to the products. And that's why there were maybe 15 people in my father's store that evening after closing time. My mother cannot explain why she stepped out of that store at that moment. She recalls needing some air, but she's never been the type to need some air. She says that she's been outside no more than a minute when the body fell from the sky. He was not close to her, but rather directly opposite across the central opening of the mall. A man fell seemingly from nowhere. He was wearing a brown business suit, and as he fell, his jacket flapped like wings and his tie cracked almost like a whip. About 3/4 of the way down, one of his shoes came off and veered off course, perhaps from the flailing of his legs. His face showed first shock and then terror, and then he vanished from my mother's view. He didn't scream, and my mother made a point of this to say that the man didn't yell, cry out, or scream. He just uttered no sound at all. Then he hit the ground, a hard, solid floor from a great height. My mother won't say more about what followed, but I do know that when a body falls from that height, it is no longer a body when it hits the ground. And I know that what remains spreads out so far and wide that it's easier to close down a mall forever than try to clean it all away. And that is not the only reason that the mall closed forever that night. The man who fell was the proprietor of the mall itself. Apparently, the mall had been suffering from severe financial difficulties and the management company was on the verge of bankruptcy. What this would have meant for the mall or for the stores operating within it, I'm not sure. It was deemed a terrible accident that the mall's proprietor fell from the top floor over a chest-high balcony railing on a night when the mall should have been closed but wasn't. Perhaps he forgot that and was leaning over to adjust or clean something when he slipped. Perhaps contrary to what authorities believed, he was not alone that night. Or perhaps something else happened, deliberate and personal. But out of respect for the deceased's family, in a place like the one I grew up in, when a tragedy like this occurs, you learn what is and isn't okay to speculate about. All that's left behind is an abandoned building, now reduced to rubble, and the memory of the man who fell from the sky. I'm a former U.S. Marshal, and I'm currently writing my autobiography, and I'd like to share a dramatization of what might be the most memorable chapter of my career. I'm not an experienced writer by any means, so this may not meet the standards that you're used to, but if you find it in any way compelling and wish to use it in the video, then the confidence that'll give me is the only compensation I require. You see, it all started late one Sunday evening back in October of 1986. I was sitting at home watching some highlights on TV when the phone began to ring, and since no one called past 10 p.m. unless it was important, I slid over on the couch and picked it up. It was my SD, or supervisory deputy, and all he told me was, "Be at the federal courthouse, 8 a.m. sharp. You got a task force briefing." I've been a deputy U.S. Marshal out of the Eastern Washington District for coming up on 4 years by that point. Long enough to know that when something big was brewing, that's exactly how it went down. No info on the target, no info on their location, just a date and time for the briefing. And after hearing the word task force, I had a reasonably good idea we'd be hunting a priority fugitive. But what I didn't know was that bringing him in would result in one of the strangest and most unsettling incidents of my entire career. The next morning, I drove over to the Spokane County Courthouse where I met my SD at the door. He directed me to a conference room on the second floor, and when I stepped inside, there was already half a dozen guys in there wearing a mix of suits, polos, and duty rigs. It was mostly my fellow marshals at first, but I also recognized an FBI special agent from the local field office. And then before the clock ticked over to 8 a.m., the room filled up with half a dozen more marshals out of the Seattle office, a handful of state troopers, and a pair of detectives from the Spokane PD. After a couple of more minutes, the room began buzzing with small talk and introductions as the caffeine started to kick in. But the chatter ceased immediately when the chief deputy marshal for the district walked in, flanked by an assistant U.S. attorney. The chief deputy marshal walked up to the speaker's stand, set down his coffee, and then got straight down to business. All right, listen up. We got a high priority apprehension on our hands, and this could be a tough one. He consulted his notes and then continued. Fugitive's name is Raymond Ridgway. He's 42 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a lean build, red hair, and dark brown eyes. Notable markings include burn scars to the palms of his hands and multiple tattoos, particular on his hands and fingers. He's wanted on 4 counts of homicide, 2 in Idaho, 2 in Oregon, and then 2 counts of murder of a federal officer after he ambushed those 2 FBI agents last year. The chief paused, consulting his notes again as a murmur of apprehension swept around the room. All reports suggest Ridgway will be armed and will have no qualms pulling the trigger on anyone wearing a badge. But do not mistake that man's reputation. He's an animal, but he's as intelligent and cunning as he is unstable, and each of you would do very well to remember that when the time comes to bring him in. The marshals began swapping nervous looks as the chief paused again, and the assistant U.S. attorney stepped forward with a stack of folders, passing them out as the chief continued. Intel puts Ridgway in the Pasayten Wilderness, up near the Canadian border. It's a needle in a haystack situation, but we've managed to narrow things down a little. After a tip from a hunter, the FBI flew a plane over the forest, and the best guess from their analysts is that he's holed up on the Osceola Peak. After instructing someone to dim the lights, the chief flicked a switch on an old overhead projector, and in an instant, the wall behind him lit up with a topographical map of the Pasayten Wilderness. This is our target zone, the chief said, pointing towards Osceola Peak, which had been circled in red. There's a shelf of even ground a few hundred meters from the summit. It's tough to access, there's more than enough cover to keep him hidden, and we think he's sheltering in the largest of the 3 caves up there. Most probably alone, but he's had time to dig in. Elevation's around 8,500 feet, it's got steep approaches from all sides, and on top of all of that, the snow's just started, meaning we've got a small window of opportunity before conditions lock us out altogether. The chief switched off the projector, and after the lights came back on, he motioned toward the men in suits. This is a joint operation. U.S. Marshals might be taking the lead, but we got FBI for jurisdictional overlap, state troopers for regional support, and Spokane's PD detectives for their work on tying Ridgway to a local safe house that he used last month. We're going in heavy, too. Full tactical long guns, and a chopper on standby for extraction or medevac if it goes sideways. And let me make something clear, gentlemen. Our warrant states apprehend or neutralize. That means dead or alive. Ridgway's not slipping through this time. And at this point, the assistant U.S. attorney chimed in. Legally, you're covered under federal warrant issued out of the Eastern District of Washington, she explained. Murder charges are filed, and the AG's office has greenlit lethal force if he engages. We have probable cause, witness statements, ballistics. He's a clear and present danger, so you're authorized to do what's necessary. Just make sure it's clean. The chief nodded, picking back up where he left off. We'll stage out of Winthrop, the closest town to the wilderness boundary, and we can't risk using air transport, so after we drive out to the forest, it's a 10-mile hump to the base of Osceola, at which point you'll split into teams of 3. Alpha's on point for the summit push, Bravo flanks east to cut off escape routes, Charlie holds the perimeter and provides support if needed. Weather's our clock, meaning we move at first light tomorrow. Any questions? One of the marshals from Seattle spoke up near the back. What happened to those 2 FBI agents? The chief got a nervous look about him. He looked at the assistant U.S. attorney. She gave him a nod, and then he cleared his throat before giving his answer. 2 agents tracked down Ridgway's hideout up in the hills outside of Boise. They contacted the HQ to report a victim up there, and she didn't want to leave. Like, she was scared too? Another marshal asked. Possibly, the chief replied. All we know is that she physically resisted when the two agents tried to get her out, which we think set them up to be ambushed. The room stayed silent for a beat, the weight of the task settling in. The chief then asked if anyone had any more questions, and when his query was met with silence, he gave one sharp clap. "Good," he said. "Gear up, brief your teams, and then go get some rest before tomorrow. I want you all in Winthrop at dawn and ready to go." The next morning, we rolled out at dawn, a convoy of black SUVs and a couple of state trooper trucks cutting through the early morning haze. The drive started at Highway 20. Blacktop was still wet from overnight rain, with the North Cascades looming large ahead of us. And after an hour, our tires ground against loose rock as we turned off onto a gravel service road. The landscape was a mix of wet bark and fallen leaves. The road narrowed fast, hemming us in with dense stands of pine and fir and mud sucking at the wheels as we climbed. At the 20-mile mark, the road ended at a trailhead, just a dirt clearing with a rusted sign. We parked and stepped out onto the half-frozen slush. Osceola Park was visible now, rock-streaked with snow, forming a jagged shadow against the overcast sky. We went over the plan one last time, then the team splits. Alpha gearing up with rifles and packs, Bravo and Charlie doing the same, and then fanning out with the radios crackling as the winds bit any exposed skin. And that hike took hours. The trail started flat, this muddy mess through a valley floor littered with downed branches and puddles, but it soon pitched up as switchbacks carved their way upward through the thick timber. The frost grew more pronounced as we climbed, from a dusting to a solid crunching underfoot. Sweat beaded around my temples despite the cold, and our breath puffed out into clouds as the trees thinned near the timberline, giving way to open slopes of shale and ice-crusted grass. Osceola's summit loomed closer, its top shrouded in low clouds, and by midday, we hit the base. Our legs were burning as the peak's steep face stared us down. I think I was too occupied looking upward to notice, because it was a member of my team that first pointed it out to the rest of us, and then once he did, we couldn't look at anything else. At first, when he pointed towards the little white and brown bird lying dead on the ground, I wondered why he'd brought it to my attention. But then I saw another dead bird just a few yards away, and then another, and another. And before long, the whole team was checking out what must have been 24 dead birds and squirrels, all lying at seemingly random spots on the forest floor. They didn't look half-eaten or display any other kinds of damage, nor was there much in the way of decomposition. It was just like they'd dropped down dead. As one of my team started asking what might have killed all those animals, I pulled the radio from my vest, hitting the transmit button as the wind began to pick up. "Bravo, this is Alpha Lead. You see anything weird around your position? Over." A beat passed, and the Bravo's voice crackled back, very tense, but they were steady. "Alpha, this is Bravo Lead. We got a bunch of dead birds and squirrels. A couple of marmots, too, all over the east flank. No blood on them. It's like they just sort of fell out of the sky. You see anything like that over there? Over." And I glanced at the nearest corpse, still fresh among the frost, and felt a very deep unease settle in my gut. "Exact situation here," I said. "There's dozens of them, all the way up the west slope. Looks like they died fast, no marks. Any theories? Over." Another pause, but longer this time, and the radio came back. Negative, Alpha. No clue. We flagged it to Charlie, but orders from Chief are to keep pushing. Priority is the summit. Ridgeway's up there, and we're not stopping for this. You good to move? Over." I looked back at my team, their confidence draining by the second as their breath clouded in the cold, and the dead stretched all around us, a grim carpet leading toward the shrouded peak. But Bravo was right. We had to keep moving. "Roger that, Bravo," I replied. "We're good. Moving up now. Keep us posted if Charlie gets anything. Alpha out." I clipped the radio back onto my vest, nodding to the team. "Summit's still to play. Eyes sharp, weapons hot. Let's go." We started climbing again, boots crunching through snow and over the small, stiff bodies, the unease settling deeper with every step toward Osceola's Peak. We crested the final rise, boots sinking into a thin crust of snow, and hit the stretch of flat ground that we'd been told of not far from Osceola's summit. The wind eased here, blocked by a low ridge of rock while the clouds hung thick. Ahead of us was the opening to a cave, a jagged gash in the rock about 10 feet wide and half hidden by a slab of granite. It was the only real shelter up there, the obvious spot for Ridgway to hole up. The other two caves were little more than alcoves. We spread out, rifles raised, moving low and quiet towards the cave's entrance. I signaled to hold positions as shapes emerged from the east. It was Charlie, and Bravo would be close by too. Charlie's team leader and I nodded to one another in acknowledgement, and then we fanned out to cover the cave. We advanced together, this tight semicircle closing in. No noise came from the mouth of the cave. There was just the crunch of our steps and the sound of the wind whistling across the peak. At the entrance, I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as we stepped inside. Charlie's light joined ours, casting shadows against the cave walls. And the cave wasn't deep. It was maybe 30 feet at most, but it narrowed fast. Inside, the air was damp, cold, and smelled of something faintly sour. We advanced carefully, scanning every nook and crevice with our flashlights, and then, about 10 paces in, we saw him. It was Ridgway, sitting with his back to us at the cave's deepest point, and we couldn't see his face, but we knew it was him.
Raymond Ridgway, U.S. Marshals, lay down with your hands behind your back.
I shouted, voice bouncing off the walls. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He simply rocked back and forth, slow and rhythmic, looking like his head was bowed. He was leaner than the photos, but I could see that matted red hair plastered over the back of his head. Charlie's team leader began barking the same sharp, overlapping command as the team's lights remained pinned on the fugitive.
Ridgway, down, now!
He yelled while edging closer, but there was still no reaction from this guy. Instead, he just kept rocking back and forth like he couldn't hear us over the noise inside his own head. The deputy to my left, a guy named Torres, moved forward, allowing his rifle to hang from its sling and then reached for Ridgway's shoulder.
Come on, asshole,
he said.
Let's...
But Torres didn't say another word, because the moment he laid a hand on Raymond Ridgway, his body locked up like he'd been hit with a live wire. He gasped, eyes wide, and then collapsed to the ground hard. I remember watching, in complete shock and horror as his arms jerked in spasms, his boots scraping the dirt as spit foamed near the corner of his mouth. Everyone was frozen, weapons still trained on this guy, yet mere moments after Torres hit the floor, Ridgway's body suddenly jerked like he'd been jolted awake, and then his head whipped around. His eyes were wild with confusion as they darted between us. More demands for the fugitive's surrender echoed around the cave at that point, but as this guy realized what was happening, he just smiled.
Down! Hands behind your back!
I snapped, and this time he obeyed, flattening out but with that smile still on his face. We zip-tied him fast, dragging him up as Charlie's medic rushed over to Torres. He was out cold, breathing shallow with his pulse racing. The medic said that it looked like some kind of seizure, but there was a chance that it could be worse. Charlie's chopper was inbound within 20 minutes. Torres got strapped to a stretcher, still unconscious, and was lifted out with the medic, and Ridgway went next. He was cuffed and just staring blankly as we loaded him up, but still, he looked like he was smiling. We cleared the cave, and the job was done. But the dead birds and the spasms, the unanswered questions hung over us as we hiked back down those slopes. We linked up with the other teams and debriefed at Winthrop by nightfall, and we had questions, but the dead animals took a back seat to Torres' condition. We were told the medics had to put him in a coma to stop the seizures, and he didn't wake up for a week, but when he did, he remembered nothing. Last thing in his head was driving out to Pasayten, and the whole raid had been wiped clean from his memory. Ridgway was in custody, locked up in pending trial, but he refused to talk. He just sat there in his cell, rocking back and forth, just like he'd done up in that cave. And after the raid, The dead birds and Torres's collapse gradually faded into the background noise of the case. The warrant execution report barely mentioned the birds, and they were relegated to a single line buried in the details. Numerous deceased wildlife observed near suspect's location, likely killed for food. Investigators shrugged it off. They said Ridgway must have been hunting them. No one bothered to test the bodies for toxins or disease, and there were no autopsies or samples. It was all too much hassle for a side note, and with Ridgway in cuffs, the focus shifted to building a murder case against him. The birds stayed where they fell, rotting on Osceola Peak, completely forgotten. And Torres' seizures got a similar brush-off. The medical report called it a sudden neurological event, either an epileptic fit or a stress-induced collapse. Doctors chalked it up to a 1 in a million fluke that just so happened to hit when he touched Ridgway. Coincidence, they insisted, nothing more. No link to the cave, the birds, or anything else up there. Torres woke up from his coma after a week with no memory of anything, as I said, and the service gave him desk duty for a while, and then he transferred out, and we never heard from him again. Nothing that strange ever crossed my path after that. I definitely went through way worse things, be they shootouts, ambushes, or fugitives who fought to the bitter and bloody end, but nothing which had that same eerie edge to it. No unexplained dead animals piling up, no one dropping into spasms for no reason, just the usual controlled chaos of the job. I've had a long time to process what happened too, almost 40 years in fact, but still, it just gnaws at me. The dead birds, Torres' so-called medical event, Ridgway rocking like he was somewhere else, none of it adds up, and no one seemed to care enough to make it make sense. I've run it over in my head 100 times, the sour smell in that cave, the way those critters just dropped. I know I should just let it go, but leaving it all unexplained feels like leaving a loaded gun on the table. I don't buy the easy answers. Sustenance, coincidence. Something was off up there and I'll never know what. And that's the part that sticks with me. The loose end that I can't seem to shake, and why that whole thing became one of the most significant incidents of my whole career. It made me realize that the same agencies that protect us from dangerous people also protect us from dangerous truths. I grew up hearing the story of Elizabeth Talbot, or Lizzie as everyone called her, from my grandmother, who first heard the story from her father, who was Lizzie's only son. It's a tale that's been handed down through our family for nearly 100 years now, told over kitchen tables and porch swings, and it's always had a certain kind of quiet weight to it. It isn't just a story about survival. It's about how my great-grandmother came to be and how Lizzie, a woman I never met, carved out a life for herself against odds that would have broke most others. I've pieced it together over the years, filling in the gaps with details both learned and imagined. So as I remember it, this is the tale of poor Lizzie Talbot. Back in 1899, a 22-year-old Lizzie was living just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a small clapboard house with a tin roof that rattled whenever the wind blew too hard. That spring, she'd married Henry Higgins, a man with broad shoulders and an infectious laugh who worked at the lumber mill down by the river. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had enough. A little garden out back, a couple of chickens, and a bed that they shared under a quilt Lizzie's mother had sewn. I picture her standing by the stove, stirring a pot of beans as Henry arrives home from work, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his clothes smelling of sawdust and sweat. And they were happy, and had a bright future of family fondness to look forward to. Then one afternoon in the summer of 1900, everything changed. Henry was at the mill, hauling logs, when a chain suddenly snapped, and a load of timber came crashing down on him. One of the beams caught him across the head, cracking his head open. His co-workers carried him to a doctor on a stretcher, blood soaking through the bandage they'd wrapped around his skull, and the doctor said he'd do everything possible, but promised nothing. Lizzie sat by her husband's side for days, wiping Henry's forehead with a damp cloth while praying for him to wake up. He did eventually, but the man who opened his eyes wasn't the same one she'd married. The doctors said that he'd heal, that the swelling would go down, but they didn't warn her about the rest, how the injury had cracked something deeper than bone. At first, Lizzie noticed only the subtle changes in her husband, but after a while, they became very pronounced. He'd snap at her over little things, like burnt biscuits or a chair left out of place, and whenever Lizzie made him mad, Henry's hands would clench into fists and he'd pace the house like a caged dog, barking at her failures. He started drinking a lot more, and would head out to taverns or saloons until the wee small hours of the morning. Then there were the nights when he didn't come home at all. Lizzie would lie awake, listening to the crickets outside, wondering where Henry had gotten to. Then when he finally did stumble home, reeking of whiskey and cheap perfume, he'd shove her against the wall by her throat if she asked too many questions. One night, he grabbed her by the hair, then tore her head back with his eyes wild and empty, saying, "You don't own me, woman," and his breath was hot in her face. She clawed at his hands, gasping until he let go and stormed out, and that was the first time that she locked the bedroom door, her heart pounding like it was trying to escape through her rib cage. Lizzie prayed hard for things to get better and for her husband's mind to heal, but over time, he only got worse. And to his wife's horror, Henry started robbing folks like a regular old road agent. First, the drunks staggering out of saloons, and then the shopkeepers on the edge of town as they closed up for the night. And word spread fast. Henry Higgins wasn't just a mean drunk anymore. He was downright dangerous. He'd come home with blood on his knuckles and a sack of stolen goods, laughing like it was all just some game. The townsfolk also whispered about the woman he'd been seen with, girls from the rough side of town who'd take a man's money and not ask his name. Lizzie heard it all, with each and every story cutting deeper than the last. She'd remember living with the man that she'd loved, and now she was living with a stranger, and one who terrified her. The breaking point came one dark, frigid evening in the winter of 1901. Henry came crashing through the door, his coat torn, his face smeared with dirt. He was drunk. He'd been in a fight and he was foaming at the mouth with anger. "Where's the goddamn supper, woman?" he bellowed, kicking over a chair. Lizzie tried to calm him down, but at the mere inference that her husband might be the cause of his own troubles, he lunged at her. Henry grabbed Lizzie by the hair, then slammed her head against the wall. Pain exploded behind her eyes before she crumpled to the floor. She looked up to see that Henry was towering over her, his heavy boots just inches from her face, and for a moment, she thought that he was going to kill her. He didn't. Henry simply spat on the floor next to his bleeding wife and then slammed the door shut on his way out of the room. Lizzie said that she'd lay there, tasting blood, and realized that she had to run. She didn't have much, just a few dresses, a shawl, and a handful of coins that she'd hidden in a tin under the bed. Then she waited until dawn, when Henry would be passed out somewhere, and then slipped out of the back of the house. She walked until her feet were blistered and bleeding, hitching rides on wagons and begging for scraps from strangers. She didn't care where she was going, it just needed to be far away from Henry. Weeks later, half-starved and shivering, she stumbled into Haw River, North Carolina, a quiet little town with a river running through it and a church up on a nearby hill. And that's where she met Benjamin Heckler. Ben was the pastor of the church, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a voice that carried when he preached. He found Lizzie slumped on the steps one Sunday morning, her dress filthy, her hands trembling. He didn't ask any questions. He just brought her inside, gave her a blanket, and set a bowl of soup in front of her. She told him her story over time, in bits and pieces, and he listened without judgment. He let her stay in a spare room at the parsonage, and before long, she was helping him with mending hymnals and sweeping the floors. They grew close, closer than they meant to, and for a while, both tried to ignore what was growing between them. But Lizzie was still married, and Benjamin wouldn't cross that line. "I can't be that man," he once told her, and his voice was firm but soft. And she understood, even if hurt, so she waited, and she fought. She wrote letters to lawyers, secured affidavits from folks back in Chattanooga, and tracked down witnesses who swore Henry had beaten her and betrayed her vows. It took years, But finally, in the early spring of 1902, a judge finally granted Lizzie an annulment, declaring her marriage to Henry null and void, and she was free. That summer, Lizzie and Benjamin married in the church where they'd first met. It was a small wedding, just a few townsfolk, a wooden cross on the wall, and vows that they meant with every word. Then a year later, in 1903, she gave birth to a boy named Samuel. He was a quiet baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's bright blue eyes, and for a while, life was good. They had a little house near the river with a porch where Lizzie would sit and watch Samuel play in the yard. Benjamin would come home from the church, kiss her forehead, and they'd eat supper together. It was their own little slice of heaven. But then, in the fall of 1905, disaster struck. I pictured Lizzie in the kitchen when she heard the horses, the sound of hooves pounding the dirt growing louder and louder until it stopped right outside her home. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped towards the window to pull back the curtains. There were 6 men, maybe 7, all on horseback, their faces shadowed by the wide brims on their hats. One of them swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground, and then Lizzie heard his voice, rough and familiar like a knife dragged across stone. "Lizzie, you in there, woman?" At the sound of her name, her stomach dropped. She'd never forgotten that voice, the way it would turn from a laugh to a growl and a heartbeat. It was her ex-husband, Henry Higgins. Lizzie backed away from the window, her hands shaking so bad that she knocked a plate off the table. It shattered on the floor, and little Samuel started crying in the next room. The men outside laughed, and Henry shouted again, "Come out, woman. I've been looking for you." The door rattled as someone pounded on it, and Lizzie froze. She could hear the clink of spurs, the creak of leather, the low mutter of the posse. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take her, or worse. Her mind raced back to Chattanooga, to the nights that she'd cowered under Henry's fists, and now he was here, with men who'd shoot first and ask questions later. The walls seemed to close in, and her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. And then suddenly, her current husband burst into the room. Benjamin's face was pale but determined. He grabbed a shotgun from the corner, the one he kept for hunting, and took cover near a window. "Lizzie," he said, his voice low and urgent, "take Samuel, and when I say, you run out the back." She started to argue, but he cut her off. "Wait till you hear the shot. They'll be distracted. Then run, and don't look back." Lizzie nodded, tears stinging her eyes, and scooped Samuel from his crib. The boy whimpered, clutching her neck, and then she crept to the back door to wait for her husband's signal. Benjamin shouldered his shotgun, parting the curtains just enough to aim while outside Henry was pacing. "You can't hide forever, Lizzie." He fired a pistol in the air, the cracks splitting the night. Benjamin looked at her, his eyes steady despite the fear in them. "I love you, Lizzie," he said, and then after that, he pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the glass shattered, and Henry Higgins fell down dead. The posse yelled, guns firing wildly, while Lizzie bolted out the back. She ran as fast as she could, her baby bouncing in her arms as her bare feet pounded against the cold ground, and she didn't stop to see if Benjamin was alive. She couldn't. There was no time. She just kept going through the trees, down to the river, until the sounds of gunfire behind her faded. With nothing but her son and the clothes on her back, she made her way north, traveling by foot and kindness until she reached Richmond, Virginia. It was a much bigger burb than Haw River, a city she and her boy could disappear in. She found work sewing in a factory, rented a tiny room above a bakery, and made damn sure her young son got his education. Samuel grew up there, a boy who never knew his father but carried that same quiet strength. Lizzie raised him alone, telling him stories of Benjamin's courage and how he'd saved both of their lives. Elizabeth Talbot ended up passing away peacefully in her sleep during the year 1940. Samuel was a man by then, with a family of his own, and when she was ready, he passed the story down to my grandmother, who told it to me when I was a kid, sitting up on her lap. It's been almost 100 years since that night in Haw River, and all those involved have long since passed. But the story of Lizzie's fear, Benjamin's sacrifice and the life they built before it all fell apart will live forever. I think about her sometimes, running through the dark with my great-grandfather in her arms, and I wonder where she found the will to keep going. Maybe it was a love, or maybe it was just stubbornness. Either way, that's why I'm sitting here now, typing this out and keeping her story alive for another generation. My name's Cal. I'm a longtime listener and I'm a forestry technician at the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska. I've been out here for 6 years now, and let me tell you, it's made for one heck of a place to work. It's beautiful, brutal, generous, and unforgiving all at the same time. But it's also the only place I've ever experienced genuine, debilitating terror. I didn't set out to be a forestry tech, not originally, but having grown up in northern Minnesota, I spent most of my spare time outdoors, either fishing or hiking with my dad. He was a logger, and we had the woods right there on our doorstep, so from a very early age I learned stuff like how to spot a healthy tree from a sick one, how to listen to the wind, or how to know when a storm was coming. I liked the quiet of it, how walking in the woods always felt like an adventure, and I always thought it'd be the coolest thing in the world to have a job where that's all you ever did. And after high school, I bounced around poorly paying jobs, but all they did was make me realize that I wanted something which kept me outside, away from cities and noise. I went to community college, got an associate's degree in natural resources, and then landed a seasonal gig with the U.S. Forest Service in Minnesota. Alaska wasn't part of the plan until a buddy from that first job told me about openings in the Tongass. He said it was a great deal, remote, rugged, nothing like the tame forest back home. So I applied, and then when I got the offer, I packed my truck and drove up through Canada. It took me 5 days to reach Ketchikan, where I caught a float plane to my first posting, and then after seeing the place from the air, I was hooked. The scale of the Tongass blew me away. It's 17 million acres of mountains and temperate rainforest, bigger than some US states even. I signed on full-time after that first season, and even after the experience I'm about to tell you, I still don't regret coming here. Not entirely, anyway. Out here, it's just you and the trees. All the spruce, hemlock, cedar, all stretching up 100 feet or more. It's my job to monitor timber stands, check for disease, mark trees for harvest, and sometimes just walk the trails to make sure everything's holding together. I've got a little cabin near the ranger station. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. And then after a day in the field, I'll sit on the porch with a beer and watch the mist just roll in off the water. It's a good life, with the kind of peace that you can't find anywhere else. What I hate, though, is the weather. It rains around 200 days a year in the Tongass, and not just a little light drizzle either. The drops come down in sheets, cold and relentless, meaning that you're almost constantly soaked through during the wetter months, no matter how waterproof your gear claims to be. And winters are worse. Short days, long nights, and the wind absolutely cuts you. But then there's also the isolation. I don't mind being alone, but weeks can go by without seeing another person, and that wears on you. The nearest town's a boat ride away, and even then, it's just a handful of stores and one bar. Sometimes I'll catch myself talking to myself just to hear a voice, and as much as that concerns me, the isolation isn't even close to the worst part of being out here. It was late August of last year, and although the days were starting to shrink, it was still light out past 8 p.m. I was out on a routine survey around 12 miles north of the ranger station, deep in a section of old-growth forest that hadn't seen any logging in years. The terrain up there can get real tough, with steep slopes, thick underbrush, and streams cutting through just about everywhere, which makes the ground incredibly uneven. I've been out since dawn, marking trees and taking soil samples, and I was exhausted. My pack was heavy with gear and my boots were caked with mud, so I figured that I'd finish up by a little creek that I knew, where I could eat a sandwich, wash off my boots, and then head back to the station before dark. I remember sitting on a fallen log by the creek, unwrapping my food with my head in the clouds when a sudden sound brought me straight back down to earth. At first I thought it was a bear, and as much as they can be a threat, you get used to them out there. They're mostly black bears, sometimes browns, and they tend to move quiet and not bother anyone unless they're startled. But this wasn't quiet. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like something massive pushing through the woods. Whole branches sounded like they were snapping, very thick ones too, not just twigs. And I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth, and just listened. The noise was coming from maybe 50 yards upstream, hidden by a cluster of spruce and ferns, and I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it clear as day. Something crunching and thudding, moving slow but steady. I roughly rewrapped my sandwich and grabbed my bear spray as fast as I could, planning on scaring it off if it got too close. Bears usually bolt when you yell, so the first thing I did was stand up and shout, "You didn't smell me yet, Mama Bear." But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder and closer, and I very quickly realized this wasn't a bear. I've heard bears move, dozens of them over the years, but this was different. It was deeper, heavier, and the rhythm was off too. It wasn't the rolling gait of a four-legged animal. It was more like something upright, something that didn't care about being quiet. When the thought occurred to me that I wasn't dealing with your average bear, I remember how my stomach dropped. I backed up a step, scanning the woods. Now the creek was gurgling behind me and the ground was moving beneath my feet, but all I could focus on was that sound. This snap, thud. Snap, thud. It was maybe 70 yards away now, still out of sight. So I yelled again, louder that time, saying, "Hey, get the hell out of here." I didn't get anything in response. No growl, no huff, no sign it even heard me. Just that steady, unstoppable movement. My heart was thumping in my chest and my hands were shaking so bad that I almost dropped the spray. I've been around wild animals my whole career. Moose, wolves, even a pissed-off mountain lion once in Minnesota, but nothing ever felt like that. And then, the smell hit me. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. No bear musk, no wet fur, not even rot. It was sharp, almost metallic, mixed with something sour, like sweat gone bad. And when it rolled over me with the breeze, I gagged. And that's when the panic started to really rise in my chest. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was big. Too big. A moose might snap branches, but they're clumsy. They're loud in a different way. This sounded almost controlled. I grabbed my pack and started backing down the trail, keeping my eyes on the trees upstream, and the noise kept coming. Closer now, maybe 30 to 40 yards at the most. I couldn't tell if it was following me or just moving parallel, but it didn't stop. And so I turned and ran. I'm not proud of it, but I bolted down that trail like a kid scared of the dark, and I didn't stop until I'd put a good half-mile between me and the creek. When I finally slowed, gasping for air, the sound was gone. No snaps or thuds, just the usual hum of the forest. I stood there, bent over with my hands on my knees trying to make sense of everything. What the hell was that? It wasn't a bear. Too big and too steady. A person maybe, but that's not a chance. Not out there, not that deep. I'd have seen tracks, heard a voice or something, but there was nothing but that noise and that smell. I made it back to that station after dark, rattled and soaked with sweat, and I tried to calm myself down, but I could only do so before my mind started racing again. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin had me sitting up and listening, and then as I tried to go back to sleep, I kept replaying what had happened in my head, trying to figure out what I'd heard. The size of it didn't add up. Bears don't move like that, like I said. And by morning, I was half convinced I'd imagined everything. Maybe I'd been out too long, gotten dehydrated, and just let my mind play tricks. But I could still hear those snaps and feel that faint tremor in the ground. It was real. I knew it. A couple of days later, I told Jim, one of the other techs. He's been in the Tongass way longer than me, a grizzled veteran who's seen it all. Storms, bear attacks, lost hikers, you name it, Jim's got the t-shirt. We were at the station, splitting wood for the stove, and I just blurted out, "I heard something out there, Jim." something big. Bigger than it should have been. And I told him the whole story. The sound, the smell, how it didn't seem to react to anything I yelled. He listened, quiet at first, chopping away at his logs, and when I finished, he set the axe down and turned to me with a very stern look on his face. And it wasn't just disbelief or curiosity. It was almost pity, mixed with something nervous, like he thought I was losing it. He asked if I was sure that I wasn't hearing things and said long days did that to a man. I said maybe, but I could tell he didn't buy it. He kept glancing at me after that, like he was waiting for me to crack. I forced a laugh and then told him maybe I was just overtired. He nodded, but the look didn't go away. And that's why I decided to shut up about it. No point in making people think that I'm nuts. And I tried telling myself that it was nothing. Overwork, imagination, whatever. But I can't lie to myself. I just can't. I haven't gone anywhere near that creek since. I stick to the trails closer to the station now, and it's just easier that way. The job's still the same. The rain, the trees, the endless quiet, but something's different now. I catch myself listening harder, waiting to hear that sound again, and I haven't heard it since, and I hope I never do. But obviously I'll never forget it either. Whatever it was, I think that it's still out there moving through those woods, and although I can't stop myself from thinking about it, I'm not sure I want to know what it is. I met him on a dating app. His name was Ryan, and back then, I thought he was everything I'd been looking for. His profile picture showed him leaning against a motorcycle, wearing a leather jacket and a handsome smile that gave me butterflies. We matched, and within a day, he'd sent me a message. "Hey, you seem cool. Coffee sometime?" I was 24, working a steady job at a marketing firm, and was super tired of the flaky guys that I'd been matching with. Ryan seemed different. Our first date was at a small cafe downtown. He showed up on time, ordered a black coffee, and asked me about my life, my job, my family, my dog Milo. He listened. He really listened. He told me he worked as a mechanic, loved fixing things, and had a sister that he was close to. And by the end of the night, he walked me to my car and kissed me. It was soft, quick, and respectful. And I drove home grinning like an idiot. And for the first few months, he was perfect. He texted me good morning, bring me some takeout food when I was stuck late at work, and surprised me with little things. A keychain shaped of the same breed of dog Milo was, a playlist that he'd made of songs that I mentioned liking. And we'd spend weekends together, sprawled out on my couch watching movies or driving out to the coast just to walk along the beach. He'd hold my hand, his grip firm but warm, and I'd think to myself, this is it. This is what it's supposed to feel like. But then, around month 6, things started to shift. It was small at first. He'd ask where I was going if I was heading out with friends, and his tone was very casual, but his eyes said a different story. Just curious, he'd say, but it didn't feel curious. It felt like he was keeping tabs. And then he started showing up unannounced. I'd be at a bar with coworkers, laughing over some drinks, and I'd look up to see him standing by the door, watching me. "Thought I'd surprise you," he said one time. And he'd have that same handsome smile, but that smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. They seemed cold. And by month 8, the possessiveness turned into something much more darker. We'd argue over nothing, like me not texting him back fast enough, and his voice would get low and tight like he was holding something back. One night I told him I needed space after he blew up because I'd gone to dinner with a male coworker. He grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to bruise it, but enough to make me freeze. "You don't get to walk away from me," he said, and I yanked my arm free and locked myself in the bathroom until he left. And the next day he sent flowers with a note that said, "I'm sorry. I just love you too much." I wanted to believe him, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise, and I ended it at 9 months. We were at my apartment and I'd rehearsed the words all day. "Ryan, this isn't working. I'm done." And when I said it, his face went blank, like a switch flipped, and he stared at me, silent for a full minute, and then he laughed and said, "You don't mean that." And when I told him I did, he stood up, grabbed his jacket and walked out without another word, and I locked the door behind him. My hands were shaking and hoped that that was just the end of things. It wasn't. And the text started the next day. "I miss you. You're making a mistake. We're not over." I ignored them, deleted them, blocked his number, but then he'd use a different one. I'd find notes on my car windshield saying things like "talk to me," written in his sort of jagged handwriting, and once I came home to a single rose on my doorstep and the petals were crushed like he'd been gripping it too hard, and I threw it in the trash and double-checked my locks. But then, he started showing up while I was at home or at work or buying groceries. I'd spot him across the street from my office, leaning against his motorcycle, staring up at my window. And I'd see him at the grocery store, at the gym, at the park where I walked Milo, always at a distance and always watching. I'd tell him to leave me alone, but he'd just sort of smile and shake his head, walking away. After a while, even my coworkers noticed. My boss pulled me aside one day and asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes, but I wasn't. I stopped going out unless I had to. I started parking closer to my building, keeping my keys between my fingers when I walked to my car. And then the threats came next. He called from these blocked numbers, and his voice was very low and creepy. "You think you can just toss me aside," he'd say. "You're going to regret this." And I'd hang up, but the words would just stick with me, digging into my mind. And I went to the police and filed a report, but they said that there wasn't much they could do without proof of imminent danger. And they gave me a card for a restraining order, but I knew that Ryan wouldn't care about some piece of paper. I bought pepper spray, started sleeping with a baseball bat by my bed, and told my mom about everything. She lived about an hour away, a retired nurse with a no-nonsense streak, and she begged me to move in with her. I said no, I wasn't going to let him chase me out of my life. I tried to carry on as normal as best I could. I went to work, I walked my dog, kept my head down, and the threats kept coming. But I got good at tuning them out and pretending that I wasn't scared. At least until that phone call that I got. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, and I was at my desk when my phone buzzed, a number that I didn't recognize, and I answered thinking it was a client. It was Ryan. His voice was different. It was colder, like he was planning every word. "Killing you wouldn't be a punishment enough," he said. "You need to hurt, like you made me hurt. So because you took something precious away from me, I'm going to take something away from you now." And after that, the line went dead. And I'd never known fear like that. I grabbed my bag, left my desk without a word, and ran to my car. My mom, she was the only person he knew how to reach, the only one I'd ever mentioned to him. I called her as I drove like an insane person out of that parking lot. "Lock the doors," I said when she picked up. "Don't let anyone in. I'm coming." She asked what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. I just told her to stay safe. And the drive was a blur. My hands were gripped to the wheel so tight my knuckles were turning white, and I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his motorcycle tailing me. And then when I hit her street, I saw his truck. This black, dented, unmistakable thing parked just near her driveway. I slammed on the gas, pulled in behind him, then jumped out and ran up the path, hammered on the door. My fist was pounding hard enough to rattle the frame, and I yelled at her to open up. The door swung open, and there was my mom, calm as anything, just staring at me. "What's all this noise?" she asked. I just shoved my way past her, my shoulder knocking into her, and then as I rushed into the kitchen, I saw him, Ryan, sitting at the kitchen table, his jacket slung over the chair like he belonged there, and I felt sick. "He got here a minute ago," my mom said, kind of frowning at me. "He said he was a friend of yours." "Get out," I said, my voice breaking into a shout. "Get the hell out," I screamed. He stood, very slow and deliberately raising his hands like he was innocent. "I don't know what's wrong with you," he said, all confused and charming. "I just needed to make a call." But as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, he turned back, looked me dead in the eye, and winked, basically saying I could have if I wanted to. I locked the door behind him. My hands were shaking and told Mom everything, every detail that I'd spared her before. She wanted me to stay the night, but I couldn't. I needed my own space, my own fight. I just drove home, checked every room, every window, and sat with the bat across my lap until the sun came up. And the harassment didn't stop after that. He'd call, leave voicemails, sometimes threats and sometimes apologies. I'd find his truck parked down the street from my apartment, empty there, but almost like a warning. I eventually got that restraining order, kept filing reports, but it was like yelling into a void. He was always one step ahead, it felt like, just out of reach, and the police were worthless. Then one day, it all just seemed to stop. There were no calls, no notes, no sightings, and I waited for the other shoe to drop, but weeks passed, and then a month, and there was nothing. And I finally felt like I could breathe again, to sleep without that stupid bat. I was at work one afternoon scrolling through my phone on break when I saw it. A mutual friend had posted a photo. Ryan, arm around a girl I didn't recognize, smiling at some bar. She looked happy, oblivious. She reminded me of me. I stared at her face, the way he smiled at her, and felt sick again. I knew what he was capable of, what he'd do when the mask slipped. And I thought about warning her, but how? He'd know it was me if I used my name. And my solution was to make a brand new Facebook profile, a fake name, no picture, and then look her up and message her. And her page was public, full of selfies and posts about her job at a daycare. And I typed the message fast. Be careful with Ryan. He's not who he seems. Get out while you can. And I hit send, watched it mark seen, and then logged out and deleted the account. I don't know if she listened. I don't know if she's okay, and a part of me wants to check to dig, but I stopped myself. I'm free of him, for now anyway, and I think that's enough. I still double-check the locks on my doors, and I still glance over my shoulder whenever I walk to my car because I know he's out there, and I know he doesn't forget. So this was the late summer in 1992, and I'd convinced my girlfriend Sarah to join me for a hike through the wilderness area up near Mount Rainier. We'd been dating for about a year, and she wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but she humored me. And the plan was simple. A day hike, maybe a 6 or 7 mile round trip through a dense stretch of forest that I'd read about in a guidebook. We packed light, just water, a couple of sandwiches, and a map, and then hit the trail just after sunrise. It started off easy, a dirt path cutting through towering trees. The air was cool and the sky was clear, and the forest was quiet except for us walking and the occasional chirp of a bird. We didn't talk much at first, just walked side by side, setting into the rhythm of it. And about an hour in, the trail got rougher. It narrowed, winding deeper into the woods where the trees grew closer together, and we crossed a small creek, stepping on slick stones to keep our feet dry, and I held Sarah's hand to steady her. She laughed when she almost slipped, a quick, nervous sound that we joked about afterwards, and it was a huge relief to see her start to enjoy herself. Then, around noon, we stopped for break, sitting on a fallen log to eat our sandwiches. After lunch, the trail climbed this very gentle slope and the woods opened up a little bit with fewer trees and more underbrush. We'd been walking maybe 3 or 4 hours total when Sarah started lagging behind. I slowed down, waiting for her to catch up. She gave me this kind of defiant look, like she wouldn't admit that she was tired, and I just smiled and told her that we'd turn back, and then, seconds later, she saw it. We were maybe 10 yards apart, me up ahead, her trailing behind when she stopped dead. I didn't notice at first, but just kept walking. And then I heard her voice, sharp and low, barely above a whisper. Oh my God. I turned around, afraid that I was about to see her pointing at a bear or maybe a snake or something, because she was frozen, staring off to her left with the color having drained from her face. I followed her gaze, and my jaw dropped. There, about 20 feet off the trail, was a tree. It was a big one, maybe 3 feet thick, and halfway up its trunk, at around chest height, was a deer. It wasn't just any deer either. It was a full-grown buck, antlers and all, and its body was just stuck in the tree. The front half hung out one side, head kind of hanging down, eyes glassy and just blank, while the back half stuck out the other side, its hind legs dangling limp. And just to make this 100% clear, it wasn't hanging from a branch or caught in a fork. It was inside the tree, like embedded in it, almost like the trunk had grown around it. I took a step closer, but Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it hurt a little. "What the hell is that?" she said, her voice shaky. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The tree definitely wasn't broken in any way, and there was no splintered bark, no jagged edges where the deer's body met the trunk, and the wood looked smooth, untouched and natural, like it had grown that way. But that was impossible. Trees don't grow around something that fast, and this deer wasn't some ancient skeleton. It looked fresh, barely starting to rot. There were a couple of flies buzzing around its head, but that was it. No stench, no maggots. There was no blood, no torn flesh, nothing to suggest violence. It was just there, almost fused with the wood in a way that made exactly 0 sense to me and Sarah. Sarah stayed there where she was. Her grip was tightening around my arm. "I don't like this," she said. But I felt this pull, this need to figure this out. I took another step, then another, until I was close enough to touch the tree if I wanted, and something about it made my skin crawl, even as my brain kept prodding at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the deer had fallen from somewhere high up and landed just right, but there were no cliffs nearby, no broken branches above, and the trunk was too solid, too intact. I crouched down, peering up at where the deer's body met the wood. The bark flowed around it seamlessly, like the tree had molded itself to the shape of the carcass. I reached out and hesitated and then brushed my fingers against the trunk just below the deer. It felt normal. There was nothing strange until you looked up and saw that impossible thing sticking out of it. Sarah yelled my name, telling me to get back, but I couldn't stop myself. I stood up and walked around to the other side. There, the deer's hindquarters hung limp, and I saw the same thing there too. No blood, no damage to its hide, no sign whatsoever of how it got that way. And that's when curiosity started to turn to fear. My stomach tightened, not from nausea, but from something deeper, something I still can't put into words. It wasn't just weird anymore, it felt very wrong. The woods felt quiet too, like everything had just stopped and started watching us. No birds or wind, just the sound of my own breathing and Sarah's quick, shallow gasp behind me. I looked at her, and her eyes were wide and her lips were pressed very tightly. "We need to go," she said. And at that point I didn't argue. I could remove myself physically, but mentally I couldn't pull away from this. How long had it been up there? Had someone or something put it there? The unease crept up my spine, slow at first and then all at once, like a cold hand closing around my neck. I thought about pictures I'd seen of animals caught in fences or traps, but this wasn't that. This was deliberate, unnatural, and the more I looked, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to see it. Neither of us looked back, but I didn't need to. I could still see it, just burned into my brain. We moved in silence, our steps quick and uneven as my heart was pounding, not from the pace, but from thoughts of what we'd just seen. Sarah kept her head down, and I knew she felt it too. That shift from curiosity to dread, the sense that we'd stumbled onto something that we weren't built to understand. We made it back to my car in almost half the time that it took to hike out, and the whole drive home we didn't say a word to each other. And when we got to her place, she looked at me and her face was still pale, saying, "We're not talking about this ever again." And I agreed. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't want to upset her any more than she already was. And we never did mention it, not to each other and not to anyone. But there are definitely times late at night that I'll see that deer in my mind, half in and half out of that tree, and feel that same cold grip around my neck reminding me that was all real. I remember it was a Tuesday night almost 10 years ago now, when my phone lit up with the text message that changed my life. It was just after 9 p.m. and I was lying on the couch watching a bit of television when I got a message notification from an unknown caller. Curious, I grabbed my phone, then felt this slight rush of adrenaline when I saw who the message was from. It simply said, "Hiya, Sean. Is this still your number? It's Laura from Leeds." A few years earlier, Laura and I had dated for around 6 months, and while at first it was a lot of fun, it didn't last. She was beautiful, intelligent, and successful, but she was also intense. Very intense. I always find passion to be very attractive. But Laura was unhealthily and rigidly fixated on self-improvement. It wasn't the healing your past traumas variety either. It was the maximizing your potential kind. And while I often agree with things she said about self-discipline and radical ownership, she sometimes took things way too far. I think the best example would be her reaction to me giving a homeless fella a few quid while we were out on a date. We'd both had a few drinks and it was proper freezing outside, so I gave him a few coins to get himself a cup of tea or something. Laura didn't say anything at first, but when I asked why she was giving me the cold shoulder then, she launched into some speech about how pathetic homeless people were, how they should learn to help themselves, and how I was an idiot for giving him money because he was only going to spend it on drink or drugs. I only gave him a few quid to get coffee on a cold night, and I know she was a bit drunk, but I thought Laura exhibited a serious overreaction to what amounted to an innocent gesture of kindness. And I suppose that was the beginning of the end, and as her work schedule got busier and busier over the weeks that followed, we started to drift apart. It was her that ended things, and while I'll confess to being upset for a few days, I quickly realized that I was better off without her. I deleted her number, got on with my life, and then jumped back into the dating pool when I felt like I was ready. But lack of success turned into a major drought, and by the time Laura texted me, I hadn't been on a date in almost 8 months. I remember staring at my phone screen, reading Laura's text over and over with my thumb frozen over the keys, when suddenly, I heard a voice in my head. I mean, not literally, of course, I'm not mental. I just told myself, "Don't do it. I know it's tempting, but don't do it, mate." Laura wasn't bad news exactly, but she'd always been a lot to handle, and I'd feel like a right wanker if I made the same bloody mistake all over again. But still, my love life was a complete non-event, and as curiosity tugged at me, I found myself drafting a reply. I typed something out and then rewrote it about 4 or 5 times until it read as neutral and nonchalant as possible. "Hey, good to hear from you, what's up?" it said. And her reply arrived in mere minutes. "I'll be honest," she wrote. "I didn't give us a real chance the first time around. I wasn't ready for a relationship, but I am now. I think about you a lot. Those months were some of the best I've had with anyone. If you're not up for it, I get it, but the offer is still on the table." I must have read it 3 or 4 times just to make sure that I wasn't making some kind of mistake. I even went back to check it actually said Laura in her original message because this didn't seem like her at all. The Laura that I knew was distant, preoccupied, her head at work and her foot halfway out the door. This was raw, honest, a little bit vulnerable too, and it knocked me over. And I mulled over it for a minute or two, and the longer I did, I felt the idea winning me over more and more. You see, she wasn't wrong. The first few months with her had been phenomenal, and half my frustration came from her putting in zero effort when we had great chemistry. But now, if she was ready to put the time in, then maybe, just maybe, I owed it to myself to find out if she was for real. We swapped a few more messages, talking the whole thing out a little more. Then, once I was satisfied that she seemed genuine, I asked her out for what I described as a second first date. We agreed to meet that Sunday at this new Middle Eastern place that I've been wanting to try, and since the following day was a bank holiday Monday, we could afford to stay up late on what would normally be a school night. That Sunday, I got to the restaurant a little bit early, so I stood outside, hands shoved in my pockets, just sort of watching the street. It was very early May, so I wasn't too chilly in just a shirt and jeans, and I was content to wait outside till Laura turned up. But 5 minutes passed, and then 10, and by the time 1/4 ticked by, I started thinking that she'd changed her mind. I checked my phone and saw that I didn't have any texts or missed calls from her, and then I felt this sort of mix of relief and annoyance wash over me as I thought, classic Laura, big promises, no delivery. But then, just as I was about to text her, she appeared, hurrying around the corner with her heels clicking against the pavement, and she looked stunning. A brunette when we dated, but her now sandy blonde hair was swept back, and she wore a black dress that clung to her like it was custom made. She'd always been slim. She went to the gym 3 times a week when we dated, but now she looked like she could have been a fitness instructor. She looked lean and strong, like she'd been sculpted. And as she got closer, she apologized for being late and mentioned how Pilates had run over, and then finished with, "You look good." And I must have blushed at that comment, probably at the way she looked too, but her compliment finished me off. I thanked her, and she gave me a little satisfied smile, and then we walked inside the restaurant, and I kind of felt like I'd won the lottery. Dinner was even better than I'd hoped. And their kitchen might have been halal, but their bar wasn't, and our Iranian waiter gave us such good service that we'd polished off 3 bottles of wine by the time the dessert menus came. Laura was different too. She laughed more, she listened when I talked, and then asked questions like she meant it. The old Laura would have been glued to her phone or trying to steer every conversation back towards work or maximizing potential. But that Sunday night, she brought up work just one time and then immediately stopped herself when she did a sort of, "Nope, not doing that, no work talk, just us." And I liked that Laura. I liked her a lot, and if that was how she was approaching dating, then I was there for it. We worked our way through 6 small plates, shared 2 mains and a dessert, and then polished off a 3rd bottle of wine while the place cleared out. When the bill landed, it was a steep 190 quid, minus the tip, but considering what an amazing time we'd had, it seemed well worth the money. Laura reached for her bag and then paused. "I've got a confession," she said, and I smiled, saying, "Don't tell me. The old 'I've forgotten my purse' gag, right?" And she didn't laugh and responded, "No, it's not that, it's something else." And the mood suddenly shifted. I leaned back in my chair and waited for her to speak, and she seemed to take a deep breath and then started back up. When Laura had decided that she was ready to start dating again, she tried the apps. She met a guy, he seemed great, but then after a few weeks he changed. He got jealous, controlling, and it wasn't long before she feared physical abuse. Laura explained that she ended things a few months back, but he wouldn't leave her alone, and over the previous few weeks, he'd been showing up outside her flat late at night. "Sometimes I see him across the street just standing there," she said, "and it's gotten worse lately. I'm scared." I told her how sorry I was and asked if she'd contacted the police, and she had, but since the guy hadn't broken any laws yet, there was really nothing they could do. Once she'd explained, Laura hesitated and then looked at me saying, "Would you come back to my place? Just for a drink, just to make sure he's not waiting. I'd feel better with you there." And I should have said no. Even with all that wine having firmly gone to my head, the warning voice was back, louder this time, yelling at me to walk away. But Laura looked genuinely shaken, so I thought it would have been real bloody mingy of me to just ditch her and go home. Plus, I'll admit that I wasn't quite ready to end the night just yet, and a few more drinks at her place sounded perfect. After I agreed, Laura gave me a relieved smile and then we called a taxi. We asked the waiter if we could wait inside for the cab, and since we'd spent nearly 200 quid, he gave us some leeway. About 10 minutes later, a black carrier pulled up, just a plain van with tinted passenger windows, and then as we walked outside, the driver slid the larger passenger door open with a smile. He told us the people carrier was the only free car that they had left, but promised no extra charge for the larger vehicle. I thanked him for the consideration and then followed Laura into the middle row of seating before he slid the door closed behind us. We carried on chatting as the driver got the people carrier moving, and I remember how Laura leaned into me as we made small talk. Her arm brushed against mine. I let it happen and felt the familiar rush of a date having gone well. I felt relaxed but excited at the same time, with the wine making everything soft around the edges. And then I heard it. It was a sound coming from the seat behind me. A soft rustle like someone moving. And I turned my head, but before I could see it, something snapped around my neck and then pulled so tight it bit into my skin. I grabbed at it, my fingers scrabbling, my lungs seizing up, and my vision absolutely was swimming, and then blurred, and that's when everything went dark. I woke up coughing, my throat burning, and as I tried to speak, I realized my mouth was stuffed with a rag that tasted like oil and sweat. I tried to open my eyes, but I couldn't. A blindfold pressed against them, tied so tight that it dug into my temples. I then tried to move my arms and legs, but found my wrists and ankles had been bound with plastic zip ties that cut off the circulation. I felt the panic wash over me. I thrashed and kicked, trying to scream through that gag, but a voice, very low and gravelly from what I remember, suddenly growled from behind me. "Move again, and you're dead." I kept fighting, jerking my shoulders and twisting my wrists until the ties felt like they were slicing into my skin. And then suddenly, the pressure around my throat returned. I gasped for air, but nothing filled my lungs, and then I remember seeing those white sparks in the darkness behind my blindfold, as Laura's voice suddenly cut through the background noise. "Stop fighting it, Sean," she said, calm. "It'll hurt less if you just let it happen." And her words hit me like a punch in the gut. My brain was stalling, refusing to connect the dots for a second before it finally hit me. Laura was doing this to me. I stopped fighting, not because I wanted to, but because if I had any shot at surviving, I had to wait, and I had to think. I then remember slumping back into the seat, breathing hard through my nose and just sort of listening. The van rumbled on forever. Every bump jolted my spine, every turn made my stomach turn, and I tried to count the minutes, to listen out for anything that might give me a clue as to who'd taken me or where I'd been taken, but fear was absolutely scrambling my brain. My hands went numb from the ties being so tight, and the gag kept me from swallowing right, meaning spit pulled in my throat and made me gag every so often as well. Laura didn't say another word, and no one did. There was just the low hum of the engine and the outside traffic, and then the occasional sound of the man behind me clearing his throat. When the van stopped, the door next to me slid open and I suddenly felt two pairs of gloved hands wrench me from my seat. They dragged me out, my bare feet hitting the gravel that stabbed into my soles, and I stumbled, but they didn't let me fall as two of them, maybe three, kept on dragging me forward. The gravel turned into grass, and then I heard twigs snapping and the air changed. It felt damp and heavy. I could smell pine and dirt and a faint trace of smoke. My legs shook, but the men kept dragging me along. One of them had his thumb dug into the flesh just above my collarbone, and I think it was one of those pressure point holds I've heard about, but my God, I didn't know anything could hurt so much. I was dragged for 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then suddenly we stopped. Grass brushed my feet again, and dead silence filled the air. There was no breeze, no birds, just the sound of my own ragged breaths. And And I stood still for a few moments, and then all of a sudden, they began lifting me into the air. My stomach dropped as I went airborne, and then I felt wood under my feet as they set me on some kind of platform. It creaked under my weight as they shoved me back against a pole, rough and splintered, and tied me to it with ropes that scraped against my skin. Then came the knives. I felt cold metal sliding against my chest, and I began to scream against the gag again. I thought they were going to cut my heart out or something, but then suddenly, I heard the sound of fabric tearing as they cut my shirt away. The jeans went next, and I felt a cold sting that made me flinch as a blade nicked my thigh. They didn't stop until I was completely naked, and I could feel the night air on almost every inch of my skin. Then I started to hear the sound of something clacking below me. It sounded like wood, shifting and stacking, heavy objects hitting the ground as men grunted and strained. After that, my gag was pulled out, and the blindfold was removed. My eyes watered, adjusting to the bright light of flaming torches, and that's when I saw where I was. My knees buckled. I was in some kind of clearing, one that looked as if it were deep in the forest, and to my absolute, horrified disbelief, I saw I was surrounded by a crowd of figures in hooded robes. Faces were hidden behind masks, smooth and featureless like these blank slates, and some held torches, the flames spitting and crackling as they cast jagged shadows across the trees. The men beneath me, the ones I'd been dragged by, appeared to be wearing tactical gear. They wore black uniforms, masks, and had guns holstered on their hips as they stacked wood under the platform. Suddenly, one of them appeared holding a hefty-looking jerry can. He walked up to the stack of wood beneath me, tipped it up, and then started pouring petrol all over it. It soaked the wood. As the sharp chemical stench hit my nose almost immediately, another can followed, and then a third. That disgusting smelling liquid glugging out as it soaked the pile of logs and sticks, and it was like some waking nightmare that I was in. I tried to shout, but my voice cracked and was barely audible. I could hardly get any words out, but still I begged them to stop as the fumes started to irritate my nose and face and throat. The men in black uniforms didn't even look up. They just carried on with what they were doing. I pulled at the ropes, the pole digging into my back, but I couldn't move. The petrol kept flowing, the pile beneath me growing dark and slick, and the smell so thick in the air that I could actually taste it. A figure stepped forward from the crowd holding one of those flaming torches above their head. The others silently parted, watching reverently as the figure advanced. Their robes and the way they moved gave the impression that they were gliding towards me. They wore a hood like the rest, but their mask was different. It was dark, almost slate-colored, but unlike the others, it was decorated with strange pale symbols I didn't recognize. And just after stepping away from the crowd, he stopped, turned, and then began to address them in a language I didn't understand. And I'm not daft either. I know the likes of French, Spanish, or German when I hear them, and I'm a big fan of Korean horror and old Hong Kong action movies. I'm no language expert, but I've got a good ear for them, and this sounded like nothing I've ever heard before. The words rolled out, sharp and rhythmic, and every so often the crowd responded in short, barking chants that echoed through the trees. And once they'd finished speaking, the masked figure turned to me, then raised the flaming torch high above their head. The flame was dancing, and then from about 10 feet away, they started walking towards me. At 8 feet, the crowd's chanting grew louder and louder as I thrashed harder. The ropes were tearing at my wrists, making them slick and sore with these bloody abrasions that were forming. And at 6 feet, I could feel the heat of the torch brushing on my skin. I screamed, a raw animal sound as I squirmed against the wooden pole. At 4 feet, the flames filled my vision as the crowd began howling. And I completely lost it. I screamed, I sobbed, and I begged, my words descending into just some frantic gibberish as snot and tears were streaming down my face. I did and said things that I didn't even know I was capable of, promised things I could never deliver, verbally debasing myself in ways I'll never forgive myself for. I prayed they'd listen to me. I begged them to see reason, but the crowd's chanting only got louder and louder until I could barely hear myself scream. I watched in horror as the masked figure closed the gap between us, gradually lowering the torch until I was just a meter or so from the petrol-soaked pyre. Another few seconds and I'd be engulfed in flames, choking on smoke, feeling my skin begin to blister and blacken. Yet just as it looked like the figure was going to drop the torch into that pyre, they raised it back up into the air again, and the crowd behind them went quiet. I froze, staring silently at the flaming torch as the figure took a few steps backwards. Then, after a few seconds of silence, they let it fall to the ground, pulled up their robes slightly, and then stamped out the flames with the sole of a long black boot. My head spun as the embers hissed into nothingness, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think properly. I wanted to be relieved, but I couldn't, because I might not have avoided a fiery fate, merely delayed it. But the next thing I know, one of the tactical guys climbed up onto the platform, his boots thumping on the wood behind me. He slipped the blindfold back over my eyes, stuffed the gag back into my mouth, and then cut the ropes which bound me to the pole. My arms dropped, useless and numb from the full-body terror I was experiencing, and then I was dragged from the platform. My legs wouldn't hold me as I touched the ground. I stumbled and fell, then the men hauled me up. It took ages before my legs could hold my weight again, but I think I only walked for about 4 or 5 minutes before I once again heard the sound of a van door sliding open. They bound my wrists and ankles, threw me in, and then after the door slammed behind me, the van got moving. I just remember being curled up and shivering, all the hope having drained out of me. I was convinced that I was going to die, but there was no chance of escape. So you can imagine the disbelief I felt when they suddenly stopped the van, cut the bindings on my ankles, and then pulled me onto the road. I hit the ground, dirt and rocks scraping my knees, and then heard the sound of the van peeling away. I was convinced someone else was about to grab me and haul me to my feet, but after a few moments of complete silence, I pulled up my blindfold, and I saw I was alone. I was on a dirt road in what looked like the middle of nowhere. No houses, no cars, just empty fields all around me. My wrists were still zip-tied, and I was still completely naked, but I could walk. I got to my feet, every joint screaming, and started on down the road. I'd never been so cold in my entire life, and it was like the wind was cutting through me, but I kept moving. One step, then another, slowly but surely, praying that I wouldn't die of hypothermia before I found help. My feet were raw, bleeding from those rocks and cuts when I finally spotted a cottage in the distance. It was a quaint little place with a thatched roof, like something you might see on a postcard. But then there was me, staggering up the path, completely naked. It was absolutely surreal. I staggered to the door and pounded on it with weak but desperate fists. A middle-aged woman in a bathrobe answered, and the second she laid eyes on me, she started screaming like a freaking banshee. Her husband charged up behind her, a baseball bat in his hands, and he was about to start beating the absolute crap out of me when he saw the bindings on my wrists and stopped. I'll never forget the look on his face, the way his eyes went all wide when he realized what he was looking at. After he froze, he just muttered, "Jesus Christ," and then ran back inside to grab something I could cover myself up with. They brought me a blanket, made me a cup of tea, and then let me take a nice long shower while they called the police. The hot water stung my wrists and my ankles and the soles of my feet, and I just stood there, shaking, watching blood and dirt swirl down that drain and just wincing from the pain as I washed myself. Just before the police got there, the nice couple gave me some spare clothes to wear. It was only a baggy pair of joggers and a faded t-shirt, but it meant the world to me. And after that, I sat in their kitchen waiting for the police as the couple whispered in the next room. When the lone officer arrived, I thanked the couple for all their help, and we then walked to his patrol car, and after taking a seat in the back, I told him everything. The dinner, the van, the forest, the hooded figures. He wrote it down and then asked in a very flat tone, "How much did you have to drink tonight?" and I told him we drank 3 bottles, split pretty evenly. I was drunk, but I wasn't smashed, and I most certainly hadn't blacked out either. He didn't argue, but I could tell that he didn't buy it. They tracked down Laura and the taxi driver, but their stories didn't match. They claimed that I'd been blind drunk, demanded that they stop the taxi so I could get out to vomit, and then after doing so, I'd walked off into the dark field never to return. They had a receipt from the restaurant, timestamps and everything, and Laura's phone went dead after that. No answers, no trace of her. And then after a while, the police seemed to just give up on everything, as worthless as the UK police usually are. They said there wasn't enough evidence, that they couldn't trace this Laura girl that I'd gone on a date with. So until I remember her address or until I remembered where I'd been taken, there was simply nothing that I could do to further their investigation. The grazes on my wrist healed, but the nightmares did not. I tried to do my own research on what had happened for a while, but it took a serious toll on my mental health. I went down many rabbit holes pertaining to Wiccan and occult practices, but found nothing like the mass that I'd seen or the language I'd heard. I talked to some of the users even on r/conspiracy, and X even posted about it, but most people didn't believe me, and one user even called me a plant. In the end, I stopped trying to make sense of anything, and in a kind of great big circle found my way back to the heal your trauma self-help genre that Laura had so staunchly avoided. I tried reading all the books I could get my hands on, even did an online course about getting rid of the night terrors, but nothing really helped. I still see that torch every night, feel the heat, hear the chants, and I haven't dated since then, and my trust issues have extended into even the simplest of everyday interactions. Sometimes I'll be chatting with someone I don't know personally, and I'll stop and think, was it you? Were you there? Sometimes when things get really bad, I think about the person with that torch, the one who, for whatever reason, chose not to light the fire underneath me. And sometimes I feel like I owe them my life, then in the grand scheme of things, they're the best friend I'd ever had. I swing between intense gratitude and hating them with every fiber of my being. Not because I wish that they'd gone through with it, but because they left me stuck here, half alive, with a story that hardly anyone believes. A few years back, me and a few very close friends went on a camping trip. We'd been planning it for literally like a year, and we were super excited to leave behind the hustle and bustle of the big city and immerse ourselves in the raw beauty of nature. And there were 5 of us. Myself, Rachel, a 23-year-old female, Rob, Jenna, Jay, and Dave. And having spent all of our high school years together, we were a close-knit group, and for me personally, the trip seemed like it was going to be the highlight of our year. But I don't think I've ever been more wrong. Our packs were hanging low with the weight of our supplies, but our spirits were high as we set out from the trailhead. The weather was fine, and we moved at a steady pace as the trail wound through the woods, climbing pretty gently at first and then dripping into these shallow ravines before rising back up again. We laughed and joked as we went, and it felt good to be out there, away from the screens and schedules with nothing but each other and the promise of a campfire cookout ahead. By late afternoon, we'd covered a good distance, and since we weren't planning on setting up camp for another couple of hours, we decided to stop for a break in a small clearing nestled beneath this low rise. And the spot felt sheltered, almost cozy, so we dropped our packs and sprawled out on the ground, pulling out sandwiches and water bottles. Apart from the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird, the forest was really quiet, and it was like this moment of stillness that made me feel like we were in a special place, and at a special time. But it turns out that I was right, just for all the wrong reasons. And after a few minutes, Dave stood up, brushed off his jeans, and then walked off into this corner of trees after saying that he had to take a leak. We barely glanced his way, too busy eating and stretching out our sore muscles. Now the seconds ticked by, and we'd talked a little among ourselves until this sudden and terrible sound just absolutely shattered the calm. It was a scream, raw and guttural, and it ripped through the air like a chainsaw in our ears. It was Dave, and it wasn't just a cry of surprise or pain. It was something very primal, something that reached into the deepest part of your brain and flipped every switch to absolute panic. We all scrambled to our feet and ran toward the sound, crashing through the brush as branches were snagging on our clothes, and we found Dave, 30 yards away, crumpled on the ground, hands clawing at his leg. Clamped around it was an old bear trap. Its rusted jaws snapped shut around his ankle. His screams had turned to gasps, and his face was pale and slick with sweat as he writhed in agony. Blood pooled beneath his leg, soaking into the dirt, and the sight of the jagged metal biting into his flesh made my stomach absolutely turn. Jenna dropped to her knees beside him, saying, oh God," with her hands flat and trembling like she didn't know what to do with them. And Rob swore under his breath, just pacing in a tight circle while Jay just stood frozen, staring at it. And I forced myself to look closer. And this trap looked ancient, with its old rusted chain anchored to a stake buried deep in the ground, and it must have been abandoned years ago, just left to rot there, until Dave's foot had found it. All of a sudden, Jay snapped out of his daze and knelt down beside Jenna. I've seen this before, he said. Old traps like this, there's a release mechanism, you just need to find it. And he ran his hand along the trap's edges. His fingers seemed to be trembling as Dave tried to stifle his whimpers, and his breathing was coming in these short, sharp bursts by then, and his blood was staining Jay's hands as he worked. And after what felt like an eternity, Jay finally found it. A rusted lever hidden beneath a layer of dirt. Hold him steady, he told us. Rob and I grabbed Dave's shoulders, pinning him down as he thrashed. Jenna gripped his hand, saying some reassurances that I'm not sure he could even hear, and Jay pressed down on the lever with both hands. The trap resisted for a moment and then it gave way. Its jaws then sprang apart, and Dave screamed again as the pressure released, his leg free but badly hurt. I looked, and quickly wished that I hadn't. The flesh was torn wide open, and the bone was visible beneath the mesh of mangled meat. We carried Dave back to the clearing as his screams just went down to whimpers, and Jenna dug through her pack and pulled out a first aid kit, wrapping his legs in bandages that soaked through almost instantly. Rob pulled out a pistol from his bag. He said he had it just in case. He held it low, scanning the trees as we planned our next move. The campsite plan was quickly abandoned, obviously. Dave needed a hospital and we were less than a day's hike from the car. We left most of our gear behind, taking only what we needed to move fast and then headed out. Jay and I supported Dave with his arms slung over our shoulders. Jenna carried the first aid kit and Dave took point with the gun as he led us back along the trail. The woods felt very different now. The peace was replaced by absolute terror. It had been transformed from this paradise into a living hell so fast that it was making my head spin. We made decent progress at first, with the adrenaline pushing us forward, and Dave was getting paler, his head lolling against my shoulder as he begged us to slow down, and the bandages were just completely covered in blood. It dripped onto the trail behind us, leaving a trail of its own. And we knew it was hurting him, but we had no choice but to keep going. And then just when we thought that things could not get any worse, they did. We were halfway to the car when it happened. This sharp crack split the air, and something whizzed past my head, close enough that I felt the rush of it. It was a gunshot, and it wasn't Rob. Someone yelled out something as we hit the ground, dragging Dave behind a fallen log. Another shot rang out, and I swear it splintered the bark above us before Rob started to fire back randomly towards what the sound had come from. He yelled at us to run, waving us on so Jay and I hauled Dave up, stumbling as we moved with Jenna keeping close behind. Rob kept shooting, trying to cover us as we ran. He was so brave, but I'll never forget how wide-eyed and terrified he looked as he kept peeking out from behind a tree, firing. The woods completely erupted into chaos. Shots came sporadically. Some felt like they were close, some distant, and the echoes were bouncing off the trees until we couldn't tell where anything was coming from anymore. We ran blindly. Branches were whipping us in the face as we were almost tripping with every step. Dave had lost a lot of blood so far, but he must have been surging with adrenaline, hopping like a man possessed as we ran alongside him to give him balance. Rob caught up, saying keep going, and he was gasping as he was reloading another magazine. My lungs burned and my legs screamed, but fear kept me moving, the trees thinning out as we neared the trailhead. I could see the faint outline of the car when the final shot cracked behind us, and then there was silence. We didn't stop to check, and we didn't look back. We reached the car, piling Dave into the back seat as his blood smeared all over the inside, and Jenna climbed in beside him, pressing fresh bandages to his leg while Jay took the wheel. Rob kept his pistol ready, scanning the tree line as I slammed the passenger door shut. Our engine turned on and we peeled out of there, the road twisting through the forest as Dave groaned and was still alive, but it felt like barely. Cell signal was non-existent, so we aimed for the nearest town 30 miles away, and that drive was just a blur. We talked to Dave to try and keep him awake, and he stayed responsive, but there was still a little voice in my head that I had to actively silence that kept telling me that he was going to die. We reached the hospital just after nightfall, screeching into the emergency room as doctors and nurses swarmed us. They took David away on a stretcher before we collapsed in the waiting room, exhausted and shaken, our clothes completely stained with blood and dirt. And hours later, a doctor came out. Dave wasn't going to die, she said, but his leg was a complete mess. He'd need surgery, maybe more than one, and there was a chance that he might never walk the same again. The police came next, 2 officers in uniforms who took our statements. We told them everything, from the trap to the gunfire, and they listened, making notes, and then asked about the shooter, but we had nothing to offer. We didn't see him at all, let alone his face, and we hadn't interacted with anyone either, so it wasn't like we could point the cops in the right direction of someone we'd pissed off. Someone had just come out of nowhere and started shooting. The cops promised to investigate, to check the woods for evidence, but their tone didn't suggest that they'd be particularly helpful. They said they'd look into it, and Dave's mom and dad called them many more times to ask for updates, but the investigation never went anywhere and the shooter's identity remains a mystery. But we never went back into those woods, obviously. The stuff that we left behind stayed there, like a little monument to the day that our adventure turned into a living nightmare. Dave recovered, and although he has a nasty scar, his rehabilitation went really well, and now you'd never guess that he almost lost his leg one time. We tried to talk about it a couple of times, late at night over some drinks, and the words always just left us, and the questions kind of just lingered. Who set the trap? And who fired those shots? But since we knew that we'd never get any answers to any of that, it's just sort of felt like speculating. It felt pointless. And none of us have ever really hiked since then either. The woods just don't feel inviting anymore, and the sound of Dave's screams still echo in my head sometimes. We survived, but something broke that day that won't heal like David's leg did, and I know for certain that he feels exactly the same way. Last year, I took a trip into the MSD wilderness here in Florida, which is way out in the Everglades. It was late July and I'd been hiking for hours alone with my thoughts. I'd done a bunch of hikes like that before and it was my way of unplugging. Then, after a while, I began to hear something. It started as a low hum somewhere off to my left, like the drone of a distant lawnmower. Insects are obviously very common out there, but what I'd heard that day was different. I stopped trying to place it, and the sound grew. This steady thrum that felt like it was vibrating in my chest. I looked around the trees and the bushes and the empty sky, but there was just the noise, getting louder and louder as it got closer and closer, until eventually it felt like it was right on top of me. Suddenly, I saw it. It was a beetle, one that looked as big as a football, as it broke from the tree line and then started flying in circles above my head. I remember freezing on the spot, moving my neck around as I stared at it, and how the chattery buzzing noise it made sounded like a hornet's, only way deeper and way creepier. And I'd seen plenty of crazy looking bugs in my years hiking, gnarly looking stag beetles and cicadas, and even those nasty ass giant horseflies whose bites hurt like hell, but nothing like that beetle thing. Its body looked like a very dark green with a slight sheen to it, and it was segmented and hard looking too, with hooked legs that dangled beneath it. It looked like it shouldn't have been able to fly, not at that size. Yet there it was, circling me 10 feet up. I wasn't scared, not yet. I was surprised, but I dealt with wildlife before, bears and snakes and even mountain lions from time to time. Weird as it was, this was just a bug, right? Nothing I couldn't handle with some spray in the bottom of my boot. I adjusted my pack and started walking again, figuring that it'd buzz off, but it didn't. Instead, the sound shifted, dropping lower, and then when I glanced up, I saw the beetle was descending. It came down fast, stopped a foot from my face, wings still pounding the air as its eyes locked onto mine. They were huge, black, glossy orbs that took up half its head, and somehow, they scared the crap out of me. They weren't like any insect I'd ever seen before. These were smooth, deep, and wet-looking, like pools of ink, and they watched me. Not just reactively, not just instinctually. There was something intelligent behind them, something that knew that I was there. Even in the Florida heat, my blood turned to ice and I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. And for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the beetle hovered in front of me. And then, with a flick of its wings, it just darts away and vanished into the trees. I stood there. My heart was pounding in my chest and I was sweating. My hands shook as I wiped my face and tried to shake the image of those eyes. I told myself it was nothing to worry about and kept moving, but the hike didn't feel relaxing anymore. I didn't hear the buzzing again, but I couldn't stop listening for it. And by late afternoon, I found a spot to camp. I set up my hammock, pulled some food from my pack, and tried to eat. And I should have been hungry by then, but I had no appetite. My mind kept replaying the beetle, its eyes and the way it looked at me, and I crawled into my hammock early, hoping a nap might reset me, but it didn't. The dreams came fast. I was back on the trail, but it was dark and the buzzing was everywhere. Above me, behind me, inside my head, I couldn't see the beetle, but I knew that it was there. And then its eyes appeared, floating in the darkness even bigger than before. They were unblinking and endless, pulling me in. And as I started to drown in them, I grasped at my throat. I woke up gasping and almost fell out of my hammock. The darkness was buzzing with the night song of the Everglades, and I just laid there, listening intently until the sun finally rose. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up fast. The plan had been to stay another day and loop back through a different trail, but I needed out. The hike back to my car was 6 miles, and I set a brutal pace, barely even stopping to drink. On the whole way, I kept my head on a swivel, ears straining. My legs were burning and my pack was digging into my shoulders, but I didn't slow down. And everything just sounded like wings to me at that point. The parking lot came into view around noon, and my beaten-up sedan was the only car there. I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors before I even caught my breath. The drive home was just absolutely insane. 2 hours of winding roads, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and I just kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that beetle flying and staring at me behind me. And I knew how irrational that was. I just couldn't stop myself. And when I got home, I dumped my pack in the garage and went straight to the shower, letting the hot water blast away the sweat and dirt. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was experiencing some kind of late-onset entomophobia, which is the fear of insects. And although that beetle had seemed like it was big as a goddamn football, it was probably much smaller. But that night, lying in bed, I kept seeing those eyes, black and bottomless, knowing almost. I got up and grabbed my laptop and started searching. Big beetles, wilderness insects, anything that matched what I'd seen, but nothing fit. The closest were some oversized species from South America, but that didn't have those eyes, that same presence. Days passed and then weeks, and I didn't say a word to anyone about it. Not my buddies who hike, not my nerdy sister who might actually want to help. I was scared that they'd think that I was crazy. And I just stopped hiking there altogether. The gear's still in the garage, just gathering dust. I stick to the city now. The only bugs are cockroaches, and the only buzzing is traffic. And I never thought that I'd ever say this in a million years, but now, I actually feel safer here. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, tough titty, said the kitty, when the milk ran dry.